When a broke single dad in thrift store clothes walks into a $20 million crisis meeting he was just rejected from, everyone assumes he's lost, until he spots the fatal flaw their Ivy League team missed for months. What happens next will either destroy him completely or prove that genius doesn't need a degree. If you want to see how far a father will go when his daughter's future is on the line, stay with me until the end of this story. And if you're enjoying it, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The elevator doors opened onto the 47th floor of Harrison and Wells with a soft chime that sounded like money. Evan Cole stepped out into a reception area where everything, the marble floors, the leather furniture, the abstract art on the walls, whispered the same message. You don't belong here. He'd known that before he even pressed the button in the lobby, known it when he'd pulled his only blazer from the back of his closet that morning, the one he'd bought at Goodwill 3 years ago for his brother's wedding. Known it when he'd tried to buff the scuff marks off his shoes with a wet paper towel in the building's bathroom. Known it in the way the security guard had looked at him, eyes tracking from his discount briefcase to his fraying collar before reluctantly printing out a visitor badge. But Mia needed new shoes, real ones, not the knockoffs that fell apart after 2 months. And the electricity bill was overdue again. And Mrs. Chen from next door had started giving him those looks. The ones that said she was running out of patience watching his 6-year-old daughter 3 nights a week while he worked his third job cleaning offices. So Evan had swallowed his pride, updated his resume for the 100th time, and applied for the junior data analyst position at one of Chicago's most prestigious consulting firms. He hadn't expected them to call, but they had. The receptionist, a young woman whose manicure probably cost more than Evan's weekly grocery budget, glanced up from her computer with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Name? Evan Cole. I have a 10 o'clock interview. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Conference room C, down the hall, 3rd door on your right. They're waiting for you. They're waiting for you. The words should have been reassuring, but something in her tone made them sound like a warning. Evan walked down the hallway, his cheap shoes nearly silent on the expensive carpet. Through the glass walls on either side, he could see the firm's world in motion. Analysts bent over triple monitors, senior consultants in video calls with clients, project managers orchestrating teams like symphony conductors. Everyone moved with purpose, confidence, the casual certainty of people who'd never wondered if they could afford both dinner and bus fare on the same day. Conference room C was exactly where she'd said it would be. Through the glass door, Evan could see 3 people seated at a long table. 2 men in suits that fit like they'd been tailored specifically for their bodies, and a woman whose blazer probably cost more than Evan's rent. He took a breath, checked his collar one more time, and knocked. Come in. The voice was clipped, efficient, announcing its impatience before Evan even turned the handle. The 3 faces that looked up as he entered were professionally neutral, but Evan had been on the receiving end of judgment his whole life. He could read the slight tightening around the woman's eyes, the way the younger man's gaze flickered to Evan's shoes and then away, the older man's too slow nod of acknowledgement. Mr. Cole, the woman, her nameplate read Sandra Pierce, VP of Analytics, gestured to the chair across from them. Thank you for coming in. I'm Sandra Pierce. This is Marcus Webb, our senior data architect, and Justin Kellerman, director of client services. Evan shook each of their hands, noting the firmness of their grips, the weight of their watches. Marcus's handshake was perfunctory. Justin's was barely there at all. Please, sit. Evan sat. On the table in front of them, he could see 3 copies of his resume. Marcus's copy had several lines highlighted in yellow. Not a good sign. So, Sandra began, lacing her fingers together. Let's start with the basics. You've applied for our junior data analyst position. I see here you've been working as, she glanced down, an overnight custodian at Westfield Office Complex? Yes, ma'am, for the past 2 years. And before that, you were a driver for a delivery service? Yes, ma'am. And you're also currently employed as a weekend kitchen assistant at Morrison's Diner. Evan felt his jaw tighten. Every word was accurate. Every word was also designed to establish exactly where he stood in relation to them. That's correct. I have a 6-year-old daughter to support. Sandra's expression didn't change, but something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Not sympathy, calculation. The look of someone adding up numbers and not liking the total. I see. And your educational background? Sandra paused, letting the silence stretch. You attended community college for 2 semesters but didn't complete a degree. No, ma'am. My daughter was born during my 2nd semester. I had to make a choice between school and providing for her. Of course. The words were sympathetic. The tone wasn't. And since then, you've been self-teaching? Yes. I've completed online courses in data analysis, statistics, Python, SQL, and machine learning fundamentals. I've built several personal projects. Personal projects. Justin cut in for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of condescension that came from 3 generations of family money and an MBA from Wharton. What kind of projects? Evan had prepared for this. He'd known they'd ask. I built a predictive model for optimal bus route timing using the CTA's public data, cut my commute by 20%. I created an inventory management system for the diner where I work, reduced food waste by 35% in 6 months. I developed a small app that tracks overtime patterns across different custodial shifts and flags scheduling inefficiencies. How nice. Justin's smile had edges. So you've optimized your bus route. I've applied data science methodology to real-world problems with measurable outcomes, Evan said evenly. Which is what you're hiring for. Marcus leaned forward. Mr. Cole, let me be direct. This position requires someone who can work with enterprise-level systems, someone who understands corporate data architecture, governance frameworks, client confidentiality protocols, someone who can step into a crisis situation and not just understand the technical side, but navigate the political landscape of a major account. He tapped the resume. With all due respect, your experience is limited. I'm a fast learner. Everyone says that. Sandra's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. But this isn't an entry-level position, despite the title. We're looking for someone who can contribute immediately, someone who can walk into a client meeting and command respect. Someone who looks like you, Evan heard beneath the words. Someone whose credentials match their ambitions. Someone who doesn't smell like commercial cleaning supplies and desperation. But he'd come this far. He'd paid for the bus fare, used a precious hour of vacation time from the diner, asked Mrs. Chen to pick Mia up from school. He wasn't leaving without taking his shot. I understand that I don't have traditional credentials, Evan said carefully, but I do have something else. I've spent the last 4 years solving problems with limited resources. I've learned to see patterns because I had to, not because a professor told me they were important. And I've built real solutions that real people use every day. Not case studies, not theoretical models, actual working systems. That's very admirable. Justin checked his watch, the gesture deliberate. But this firm bills clients $300 an hour for junior analyst time. Our reputation depends on every person who interacts with a client having the background to justify that rate. No offense, but you don't. The words landed like stones. Evan felt his face heat, but kept his voice level. Then maybe you're billing for the wrong things. Sandra's eyebrows rose. Excuse me? You're billing for credentials, not results. The client doesn't care where I went to school. They care if I can solve their problem. The client cares very much where you went to school, Marcus said flatly, because that's how they know you can solve their problem. That's how trust works in this industry. Is it? Evan met his eyes. Because from what I've read about Harrison and Wells, your value proposition is outcomes-based analytics. You promise measurable improvements. Your website says, we turn data into decisions. It doesn't say we have really impressive resumes. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Mr. Cole, Sandra said finally, her professional warmth replaced with something colder. We appreciate you taking the time to come in today. We'll be in touch if we decide to move forward. It was a dismissal. Evan knew it. They knew he knew it. He stood, shook their hands again. Marcus's grip was even more perfunctory this time. Justin didn't bother looking up, and turned toward the door. That's when he saw her. Through the glass wall of the conference room, in the hallway beyond, stood a woman he hadn't noticed on his way in. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. Unlike everyone else in this building, she wasn't performing, wasn't projecting. She simply stood there, arms crossed, watching the interview with an intensity that made Evan's skin prickle. Their eyes met for just a second. Her expression gave nothing away. Then she turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing around the corner before Evan reached the door. "Close the door on your way out, please," Sandra called from behind him. Evan pulled the door shut with a soft click. The hallway was quiet, peaceful, insulated from everything messy and desperate and real. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, feel the hot pressure of humiliation in his chest. 3 jobs. 4 years of teaching himself at 2 a.m. after his daughter fell asleep. Hundreds of hours bent over free online courses, building projects nobody would ever look at, convincing himself that skill mattered more than pedigree. And for what? To be dismissed in 15 minutes by people who'd decided he wasn't good enough before he'd even sat down. Evan was halfway to the elevator when the screaming started. Not actual screaming, this was a corporate office, where catastrophe announced itself in urgent voices and rapid footsteps rather than outright panic. But the effect was the same. Doors opened, people emerged from offices. The hallway that had been professionally quiet 10 seconds ago suddenly filled with motion, with tension, with the electric buzz of crisis. Complete collapse. Client pulled the entire contract. $20 million. Evan slowed, then stopped. Something was happening, something big. The woman who'd been watching his interview emerged from an office 20 feet away, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking too quietly for Evan to hear the words, but her body language told the story. Tight shoulders, sharp gestures, the controlled intensity of someone managing a disaster. Behind her, through the open office door, Evan could see into what looked like a crisis command center. A dozen people crowded around a conference table, all talking at once. Multiple laptops displayed charts, spreadsheets, presentation decks. And on the wall-mounted screen in letters large enough to read from the hallway, Project Horizon. Status. Terminated client decision. Contract canceled exposure. 20 Fom Forum. Evan had worked enough crisis nights. The grease fire at the diner, the water main break at the office complex, the time the delivery company's routing system crashed during holiday rush, to recognize the specific flavor of professional disaster. This was the corporate equivalent of everything catching fire at once. He should leave. Should walk to the elevator, go back to his life, forget this place and its people and the way they'd looked at him like he was something they'd scraped off their shoes. But through the open office door, past the crowd of expensive suits, Evan could see the screen more clearly now. Someone had pulled up what looked like a retention analysis, charts showing user engagement over time, cohort breakdowns, churn predictions. Project Horizon. He'd read about it in the trade press while preparing for the interview. Harrison & Wells had been hired by a fintech startup to analyze their customer retention and provide strategic recommendations. The startup had been counting on those recommendations to secure Series B funding. The contract was supposed to be H&W's biggest success story of the quarter, and now it was terminated. Evan took a step closer to the open door. Then another. Nobody noticed him. They were all too busy managing the fallout. On the screen, someone was cycling through slides, retention curves, engagement metrics, user behavior flows, the kind of analysis that should have been bulletproof from a firm like Harrison & Wells. But something was wrong. Evan's brain, the part of him that had taught itself to see patterns in bus schedules and inventory waste and overtime trends, clicked into gear despite himself. The retention numbers were too smooth, too clean. Real user data was messy, full of noise and anomalies and unexpected dips. But these curves looked like they'd been drawn with a ruler. And the active user definition in the corner of one slide, it's the data validation. A male voice, sharp with frustration, cut through the noise. They're saying our retention numbers were inflated, that our model overcounted active users by... He paused, clearly reading from something. Significant margin. They're claiming we gave them false confidence in their unit economics. That's impossible, Sandra's voice. She'd left the interview room and joined the crisis. We ran that analysis 3 times, 3 independent reviews, Marcus personally validated the methodology. Well, someone made a mistake. Justin, sounding less polished now, more desperate. Because we just lost $20 million, and the client is threatening to publish a case study on how we failed them. Evan's eyes tracked back to the screen. The user retention chart was still visible, and now that he was looking at it with the context of the problem, he could see it. Not the mistake itself, not yet, but the shape of where a mistake would hide. He'd seen something similar in his bus route analysis back when he'd first started teaching himself data science. He'd been trying to predict optimal commute times and kept getting predictions that were just slightly off. Everything looked right on the surface, but the model kept telling him to catch buses that were already full. It had taken him 2 weeks to figure out that his active bus definition was wrong. He'd been counting any bus that moved at all as active, but some buses were just repositioning to depots. They were moving, but not picking up passengers. His model had been technically correct, but practically useless. Looking at the Project Horizon analysis, Evan could see the same shape of error. The retention curve was too confident, too clean, which meant their email deduplication process missed device-level duplicates. Evan didn't realize he'd spoken out loud until every head in the room turned toward him. The hallway went silent. Sandra Pierce stood in the doorway, staring at him like he'd materialized out of thin air. "What did you just say?" Evan's mouth went dry. He'd just interrupted a crisis meeting at a firm that had rejected him 5 minutes ago. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to apologize and leave, but Mia needed shoes, and he'd just seen something that might actually matter. "The retention numbers," Evan said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "They're counting the same users multiple times. Your active user definition is tracking email addresses, but people use multiple devices, phone, tablet, laptop. If someone logs in from 3 devices, you're counting them as 3 active users instead of 1. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd to the doorway. His face was red, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "Who the hell are you?" "He's nobody." Justin appeared beside Marcus. "He's the guy we just rejected for the analyst position. Security should have walked him out already." "I saw the chart," Evan said quickly before they could shut him down. "Your retention curve is too smooth. Real user behavior is messier. The only way you get a curve that clean is if you're overcounting, tracking actions instead of actual people. And if you're doing email-based deduplication, you're missing all the device-level duplication that... This is absurd." Marcus turned to Sandra. "Call security, now." But Sandra wasn't looking at Marcus. She was looking past Evan, down the hallway, to where the woman with the sharp eyes had reappeared. The woman who'd watched Evan's interview without saying a word. She walked toward them slowly, deliberately, her footsteps precise on the carpet. When she reached the doorway, the crowd parted automatically, instinctively. Not out of fear, out of respect. 10 minutes, she said quietly. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" "Give him 10 minutes to explain." The woman's eyes were on Evan now, measuring, calculating. "If he's wrong, we've lost nothing we hadn't already lost. If he's right..." She let the sentence hang. "Camille, with all due respect," Sandra began. 10 minutes, Sandra." The woman, Camille, didn't raise her voice, but something in her tone made it clear the discussion was over. "Conference room A. Bring the full Project Horizon dataset." Then she turned to Evan. "You have 10 minutes to either save this firm $20 million or prove you're exactly as unqualified as everyone thinks. Which is it going to be?" Evan's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. This was insane. He'd seen one chart for 30 seconds. He could be completely wrong. He could humiliate himself in front of the entire executive team. He could... "I'll need access to the raw data," he heard himself say. "Not just the summary charts. The actual query logic behind your active user definition and the deduplication process." Camille's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not quite approval, more like recognition. "Conference room A," she repeated. 5 minutes. Then she walked away, and the crowd dissolved behind her, following like gravity. Evan stood in the hallway, his thrift store blazer suddenly feeling even more threadbare, his heart still pounding, his brain screaming that he'd just volunteered for the most public failure of his life. But he'd seen something. He was almost certain he'd seen something, and Mia needed shoes. Evan took a breath and walked toward conference room A. Conference room A was twice the size of the room where they'd rejected him, with a view of Lake Michigan that probably added 6 figures to the building's rent. The long table could seat 20, but only 10 people had gathered. Sandra, Marcus, Justin, 3 other analysts Evan didn't know, 2 people who looked like senior partners based on their age and the quality of their suits, and Camille. Camille sat at the head of the table, silent, watching. A laptop had been set up at the far end, facing the wall-mounted screen. Sandra gestured to it with the air of someone arming a bomb. Project Horizon Master Dataset. Full query logic, raw user tables, all deduplication processes. You have 9 minutes left. Evan sat down, his fingers already reaching for the keyboard. The laptop was probably worth more than his car. The software suite was premium tier, the kind of thing he'd only played with in free trials. But data was data, and a pattern was a pattern. He pulled up the query logic first, the code that defined active user for the retention analysis. It was clean, professional, exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from a top-tier consulting firm. And it was wrong. Here, Evan turned the laptop so the screen would project. The query code appeared on the wall in crisp professional formatting. SQL select distinct email address from user on actions where action date, EUL start date, and action type in, login, transaction, feature use. Group by email address. Having count was action date. So is 3. This is your active user definition, Evan said. It looks for users who performed at least 3 actions in the time period, and it deduplicates by email address. He paused. But it doesn't account for device-level duplication. Yes, it does. Marcus's voice was tight. That distinct clause removes duplicate email addresses. It removes duplicate email addresses, Evan agreed. But the source table, user actions, logs every action from every device separately. So if I log in from my phone at 8 a.m., my laptop at noon, and my tablet at 8 p.m., that's 3 actions. Your query sees 3 actions from 1 email address and marks me as active, which is correct. Exactly, Justin said. So what's the problem? The problem is scale. Evan pulled up the user actions table. How many rows are in this table for the analysis period? One of the unnamed analysts checked her laptop. 4.2 million actions. And how many unique email addresses did you identify as active users? 1.4 million. Sandra's voice was cautious now, which gave us the retention rate we reported to the client. Evan nodded. Now run a query that deduplicates by device ID instead of email address. That's not standard practice, Marcus objected. Email is the primary user identifier. Do it anyway. The room went quiet. Then one of the senior partners, a silver-haired man whose expression had been growing more thoughtful, nodded to the analyst. Run it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. The query executed. Results populated. 1.5 million unique devices, she read, her voice careful, for 1.4 million users. Evan leaned back. That's your first problem. You have more devices than users, which means your active user count is inflated. You're counting some people multiple times because they use multiple devices. That's a 7% difference, Justin said quickly. 7% doesn't explain. That's not the only problem. Evan pulled up another query. Your retention calculation is based on how many active users returned in subsequent periods. But you're not just tracking whether they returned, you're tracking whether they performed 3 or more actions, and you're counting each device separately. He modified the query, adding device-level groupings. If I use my phone every day but my laptop once a month, you're counting me as 2 different user patterns. One highly engaged user on mobile, one barely engaged user on desktop. And your retention curve is averaging those patterns together, which smooths out the real variation. The analyst ran the modified query. The retention curve that appeared on the screen was jagged, irregular, dropping sharply in weeks 3 and 4 before stabilizing. Nothing like the smooth, confident curve in the original analysis. That's... Sandra trailed off, staring at the screen. That's the real retention pattern, Evan finished. Users are dropping off faster than you reported. Your active user count was inflated by device-level duplication, and your retention rate was inflated by counting multi-device users as multiple engagement patterns. Marcus had gone very pale. How much? How much what? How much did we overcount? Evan turned back to the laptop. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline, fear, the surreal sensation of being right about something that mattered, but he forced them steady. He rebuilt the query from scratch, adding proper device fingerprinting, true user-level deduplication, engagement scoring that accounted for device patterns. The numbers that appeared made the room go silent. Real active user count, 970,000, not 1.4 million. Justin did the math in his head, his face draining of color. That's a 31% inflation. And real retention rate, Evan clicked through to the corrected curve. 68% at 6 months, not 91. Sandra sat down heavily. We told them they had best-in-class retention. We told them their unit economics could support aggressive scaling. We told them... She pressed her hands to her face. Oh God. We told them everything they wanted to hear, based on numbers that were wrong. It's not that the methodology was bad, Evan said quietly. It's that the assumptions were wrong. Email-based deduplication works fine for systems where users only access from one device. But for a mobile-first fintech app where people check their balance from their phone, make transfers from their laptop, and verify transactions from their tablet, he gestured to the screen. The standard approach breaks down. The silver-haired senior partner leaned forward. You saw this in 30 seconds, from a hallway, through a glass door. I've made this exact mistake before, Evan admitted. Different context, much smaller scale, but same fundamental error. I learned to recognize the shape of it. The shape of it? Camille spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through everything else. How many other consulting firms do you think made this same mistake, Mr. Cole? I don't know. Guess. Evan thought about it. Any firm that uses email-based deduplication as their standard practice, which is probably most of them? Camille's smile was cold. Every firm that responded to the client's RFP used email-based deduplication. We saw their methodologies. They're all building on the same assumptions. She turned to Sandra, which means they would have all given the same inflated numbers. But we're the ones who won the contract, Marcus said bitterly, so we're the ones who take the blame. Yes, Camille stood. Mr. Cole, you've just diagnosed a $20 million mistake in under 10 minutes. Congratulations. Now tell me, can you fix it? Evan's mouth went dry. Fix it? The client canceled the contract 3 hours ago. They're currently taking meetings with 3 of our competitors. If we can deliver a corrected analysis, one that honestly shows their real metrics and gives them actionable recommendations based on accurate data, we might be able to salvage this. Camille's eyes were hard, but it would need to be bulletproof. Better than bulletproof. It would need to be so obviously superior to our original work that they'd be fools to trust anyone else. How long do I have? 72 hours. The client's board meets Friday morning to decide whether to pursue legal action against us or simply tank our reputation. If we can present a completely rebuilt analysis before that meeting, we have a chance. 72 hours. Evan thought about his shifts at the office complex, the diner, the custody schedule with Mia. Thought about Mrs. Chen and the electricity bill and the scuffed shoes he'd tried to buff in the bathroom. Thought about the way Sandra had dismissed him, the way Marcus had sneered at his bus route optimization, the way Justin had checked his watch like Evan's time wasn't worth anything at all. What if I can't? Evan asked. What if I try and fail? Camille's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Then I'll walk you out of this building myself and make sure you never work in this industry again. But if you succeed... She paused. If you succeed, you're hired. Full-time. Senior analyst, salary that would let you quit your other 3 jobs. Benefits, the whole package. The room held its breath. And if I need access to data or systems I don't have clearance for? Evan asked. You'll have whatever you need. Camille pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, and Evan's visitor badge buzzed in his pocket. I just upgraded your credentials to full access. You can work from any station in the building, 24-hour access. You want coffee at 3 a.m., the executive lounge is yours. She locked eyes with him, and Evan saw something there he recognized. Not pity, not charity, understanding. 72 hours, Mr. Cole. Show me what someone with your background can do when someone finally gives them a real chance. Then she walked out of the conference room, leaving Evan alone with 10 people who'd been ready to throw him out 15 minutes ago. Sandra cleared her throat. You'll need a workspace and access to the client's full data warehouse, not just the extracts we used. And she glanced at Marcus. Probably someone to help navigate our internal systems. I'll manage. Evan's voice sounded steadier than he felt. Just point me to a desk. They set him up in a small office on the 43rd floor. Not quite executive level, but not the bullpen either. Probably someone's office who was out on client work. The computer was high-end, the monitor enormous, the chair the kind of ergonomic masterpiece that cost more than Evan's monthly rent. As soon as the door closed behind the last analyst, Evan pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Chen. Mr. Cole, is everything okay? I need a favor. A big one. Evan closed his eyes. Can you watch Mia for the next 3 nights? I'll pay you double, triple, whatever you need, but I have a situation at work. A pause. You got the job? Maybe, if I don't screw this up, but I need these 3 days. Mia is always welcome here. You know that. You just focus on your work. And Mr. Cole? Her voice softened. Make them see what I see. Evan hung up and sat in the expensive chair, staring at the enormous monitor, feeling the weight of 72 hours pressing down on him like gravity. Then he opened the Project Horizon dataset and got to work. The first thing he did was rebuild the user table from scratch. Not just fixing the deduplication error, completely rethinking how to define an active user in a way that actually meant something. Email-based tracking was out, device fingerprinting was in. But that alone wasn't enough. He needed to distinguish between genuine engagement and empty activity. Someone who checked their balance 50 times a day wasn't necessarily more engaged than someone who made one thoughtful transaction. Evan built a weighted scoring system. Logins counted for something, but transactions counted for more. Feature exploration signaled interest. Support ticket creation signaled problems. Payment failures signaled risk. He pulled in every data point he could find and started building a model that didn't just count actions, it measured meaning. By midnight, his eyes were burning and his back ached from the unfamiliar luxury of the ergonomic chair. But he'd rebuilt the active user definition, and the numbers were starting to make sense. Real active users, 982,000. Close to his initial estimate. Real retention at 6 months, 67.3%. Not great, but honest. But the client wouldn't pay $20 million for honesty. They'd pay for insight. For recommendations they couldn't get anywhere else. Evan pulled up the corrected retention curve and started looking for patterns. Where were users dropping off? Why? What separated the 67% who stayed from the 33% who left? The answers were in the data. He just had to find them. At 2 a.m., a knock on the door made him jump. He turned to find Camille standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Still here, she observed. I have 60 hours left. I know. She set one coffee on his desk. Drink. You look like you're running on fumes. Evan picked up the cup, real coffee, not the break room sludge he was used to, and took a grateful sip. Thank you. Camille pulled up a chair and sat, studying the monitor. How bad is it? The original numbers? Bad. 31% overcounting, 23 percentage point inflation on retention. Evan gestured to his rebuilt model. But the real data isn't terrible. The client's product is solid. Their retention is industry average, which means they have room to improve, but they're not bleeding users. Can you tell them how to improve? Maybe. Evan pulled up a segmentation analysis he'd started. I need to understand why users leave. The data's here, but I need more time to map the patterns. Camille was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the screen. Then, why did you come back? What? After the interview, you were walking to the elevator. You could have left, should have left. But you came back. Why? Evan thought about lying. about giving her some professional answer about seeing an opportunity or wanting to prove himself. But it was 2 a.m. and he was too tired for anything but truth. "I needed it to mean something," he said quietly. 4 years of teaching myself at night. 4 years of being told I wasn't good enough. I needed one person, just one, to look at what I could do instead of what I didn't have. He met her eyes. "You gave me 10 minutes. That's more than anyone else ever gave me." Camille's expression softened, just slightly. "You know why I gave you those 10 minutes? No? Because 20 years ago, I was you." She took a sip of her own coffee. "Different circumstances. Same position. I was a first-generation immigrant, single mother, working 3 jobs, teaching myself at night. I applied to this firm 6 times, got rejected 6 times. The 7th time, someone took a chance on me." She gestured to the office around them. "Now I own 40% of the company." Evan stared at her. "Don't waste your time trying to impress them," Camille continued. "Don't waste your time being angry at them. Just do the work. Do it better than anyone else could. That's the only thing that matters." She stood, headed for the door, then paused. "And Mr. Cole, you've got 59 hours left. I suggest you spend less time talking and more time working." Then she was gone, leaving Evan alone with his coffee and his data and the crushing weight of possibility. He turned back to the monitor, pulled up the user segmentation analysis, and dove back in. The night dissolved into patterns: churn prediction models, feature utilization heat maps, customer lifetime value projections. Evan built and rebuilt and refined, guided by instinct and experience and the memory of every mistake he'd ever made in his personal projects. When the sun came up, he'd barely noticed. When people started arriving for work, he was so deep in the code that the sounds of the office waking up felt like they were happening in another dimension. By noon on day 2, he'd identified the critical patterns. Users who never connected a bank account churned at 89%. Users who made at least one transaction in their first week had 81% 6-month retention. Users who engaged with the budgeting tools were worth 3.2x as much in lifetime value. The recommendations practically wrote themselves. Optimize onboarding to drive bank connection, incentivize first-week transactions, surface budgeting features more prominently. But that wasn't enough. Every consulting firm could see those patterns with clean data. Evan needed something more, something that would make the client understand that what Harrison and Wells offered now was so far beyond what they'd delivered before that it wasn't even the same product. He needed the model to be predictive, not just explaining what had happened, but forecasting what would happen next. Who was about to churn? Who was about to become a power user? Who was a hidden gem waiting to be activated? That required machine learning. Real machine learning, not just the basic regression models most consulting firms threw around. Evan had taught himself ML fundamentals on YouTube and free courses, had built a few toy models, but he'd never worked with production-scale data or enterprise tools, never had access to the kind of computing power that made complex models feasible. Until now. He pulled up the firm's ML pipeline, custom-built, enterprise-grade, exactly the kind of thing he'd dreamed about using, and started building. Day 2 became day 3, became the early hours of Friday morning. Evan's eyes burned, his body ached. He'd lived on coffee and vending machine snacks and the occasional sandwich that mysteriously appeared on his desk, probably courtesy of Camille or one of the analysts who'd started checking on him with increasing frequency. But the model worked. He'd built a churn prediction engine that could identify at-risk users 30 days before they left with 84% accuracy. A lifetime value forecaster that segmented users into value tiers with 91% confidence. An engagement scoring system that didn't just measure activity, it measured potential. And then, because he was too tired to second-guess himself, he built one more thing. A dashboard. An interactive, visual, gorgeous dashboard that let the client explore their own data, drill down into segments, test scenarios, and see in real time how different strategies would impact retention. It was the kind of thing he'd always wanted to build, but never had the tools for. The kind of thing that would make the analysis feel alive instead of static. At 4 a.m. Friday morning, with 3 hours until the client meeting, Evan ran the final validation checks, found no errors, and allowed himself to close his eyes for 30 seconds. When he opened them again, someone was shaking his shoulder. "Mr. Cole, wake up." Sandra Pierce stood over him, looking exhausted herself. Behind her, Marcus and two other analysts were setting up the conference room for the presentation. "What time is it?" Evan's voice came out rough, his throat raw from 3 days of too much coffee and not enough water. 6:30. Client arrives at 7. Camille wants to review your work before they get here. Sandra's expression was unreadable. "Whatever you built, I hope it's good, because if this doesn't work, we're all going down together?" Evan stood, his body protesting every movement. "It's good. How do you know?" He pulled up the dashboard on the conference room screen. The retention curves, the churn predictions, the lifetime value segmentation, all flowing together in an interface that made complex data feel simple. "Because it's the kind of thing I wish I'd had when I was building my bus route model," Evan said quietly. "It's not just analysis. It's a tool they can use, a system they can grow with, something that gets better the more they use it." Sandra stared at the screen. Then she pulled out her phone and typed quickly. 30 seconds later, Camille appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just walked to the screen and started clicking through the dashboard, her expression neutral, her eyes moving fast. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, she turned to Evan. "Client arrives in 15 minutes. You're presenting." "Me?" Evan's stomach dropped. "I thought you built it. You present it." Camille's voice was firm. "They need to see that this isn't just the same firm that failed them with a fresh coat of paint. They need to see that we've fundamentally rethought our approach. And that starts with having the person who actually did the work explain what they did and why it matters." "But Evan gestured to his rumpled clothes, his 3-day stubble, his complete lack of corporate polish. "I'm not." "You're exactly what you need to be." Camille cut him off. "You're someone who rebuilt their entire analytical foundation in 72 hours because you understood the problem better than anyone else in this building. That's what they need to see." Evan took a breath, thought about Mia and Mrs. Chen and the electricity bill and the scuffed shoes in the bathroom. Thought about 4 years of being told he wasn't good enough. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." At precisely 7 a.m., the client arrived. 3 people. The CEO, a sharp-eyed woman named Miranda Chen, her CFO, a careful man named James Porter, and their head of product, a younger guy named Alex, something who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. They did not look happy to be there. Camille made the introductions, smooth, professional, giving nothing away, and gestured to the conference room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," she began. "I know trust has been damaged. I know we gave you analysis that turned out to be fundamentally flawed. And I know that you have every right to walk out of this room and never speak to us again." Miranda's expression didn't change. "Then why are we here?" "Because in the 72 hours since you canceled our contract, we've done something most consulting firms never do." Camille gestured to Evan. "We admitted we were wrong. We figured out why we were wrong. And we rebuilt everything from scratch. This is Evan Cole. He's going to show you what we should have delivered in the first place." Then she sat down, leaving Evan standing alone at the front of the room with 3 hostile faces staring at him. His hands were shaking, his mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to apologize, to minimize, to make himself smaller. But Mia needed shoes, and he'd spent 72 hours building something that actually mattered. Evan pulled up the dashboard and began. 3 days ago, this firm told you that your 6-month retention rate was 91%. That number was wrong. And it was wrong because we made an assumption that everyone makes, that email addresses equal users. They don't. He clicked through to the corrected curve. Your real retention is 67%. That's not best in class. But it's honest. And it's something we can work with. Miranda leaned forward slightly. Not much, but enough. "More importantly," Evan continued, "we can now tell you exactly why users leave and exactly what you can do about it." He pulled up the churn prediction model. This is a real-time forecasting system. It identifies users who are likely to churn 30 days before they leave, not based on gut feeling, based on behavioral patterns in your data that we can actually measure and track. He showed them the patterns: bank connection gaps, first-week transaction failures, feature exploration drop-offs, showed them how each pattern predicted churn with statistical confidence, showed them the interventions that could reverse the patterns. Then he pulled up the lifetime value segmentation. And this tells you who's worth saving, because not all users are equal. Someone who uses your budgeting tools is worth 3 times more than someone who just checks their balance. If you focus your retention efforts here, he highlighted the high-value segments, you get 3 times the return on investment. Alex, the head of product, was sitting up straighter now. Can we drill down into specific user cohorts? Yes. Evan showed him how. The dashboard responded in real time, filtering and recalculating, showing exactly how different user groups behave differently. And can we model what happens if we change our onboarding flow? James, the CFO, asked carefully. Yes. Evan pulled up the scenario modeling tool. Tell me what you want to test. For the next 30 minutes, they threw scenarios at him. Evan answered every one, the dashboard responding fluidly, the data telling stories that were finally, actually true. When they finished, Miranda sat back in her chair and looked at Camille. This is what you should have delivered the first time. Yes, Camille said simply. It is. And you built this in 3 days. Evan built this in 3 days. Miranda turned to Evan. Her expression was still hard, but something in her eyes had shifted. Why should we trust you now? You failed us once. Evan thought about giving her a corporate answer, about promises and process improvements and lessons learned. But it was still too early in the morning, and he was still too tired for anything but truth. Because I've made this exact mistake before, he said quietly. On a much smaller scale, with much lower stakes, but the same fundamental error. I built a model that was technically correct but practically useless because I was measuring the wrong thing. He gestured to the dashboard. I know what it feels like to realize you've been building on a broken assumption, and I know what it takes to rebuild from scratch. This, he tapped the screen, isn't just better data. It's a complete rethinking of how to measure what matters. And you did this alone? In 3 days? I had access to the firm's systems and data. But yes, I did the work. Miranda exchanged a glance with James and Alex. Some silent communication passed between them. Then she turned back to Camille. We need to discuss internally. We'll have an answer for you by end of day. They stood, shook hands, filed out of the conference room with the careful neutrality of people who'd been burned once and weren't ready to be burned again. When the door closed behind them, the room exhaled. Sandra dropped into a chair. Marcus leaned against the wall. Camille stood perfectly still, her expression giving nothing away. Well, Sandra said finally, that went better than expected. Did it? Marcus's voice was tight. They wouldn't commit. They didn't walk out. Sandra's smile was grim. Given where we started, I'll take it. Evan felt the exhaustion hit him all at once. 3 days of adrenaline, 3 days of coffee and fear, and the crushing pressure of everything riding on this one chance. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred at the edges. Mr. Cole, Camille said quietly, go home, get some sleep. We'll call you when we hear from them. Evan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He gathered his few things, wallet, phone, the visitor badge that had somehow become his lifeline, and walked out of the conference room. The office was fully awake now, the morning rush in full swing. People glanced at him as he passed, some curious, some confused, all wondering who this disheveled stranger was and why he'd just spent 3 days in their building. Evan didn't care. He just wanted to see his daughter. He took the elevator down to the lobby, walked past the security guard who'd looked at him with such skepticism 3 days ago, and stepped out onto the Chicago street. The morning was cold and bright. Rush hour traffic hummed. The city moved around him with its usual indifferent energy. Evan pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Chen. Mr. Cole? She answered on the first ring. I'm on my way to get Mia. Is she awake? Just finishing breakfast. She missed you very much. I missed her too. Evan's throat tightened. Mrs. Chen, I don't know yet if any of this worked, but whatever happens, thank you for believing it might. It worked already, Mrs. Chen said firmly. You gave yourself a chance. That's what worked. Evan hung up and started walking toward the bus stop. His body ached. His eyes burned. He probably smelled like 3 days of stress and coffee and desperation. But he'd done it. He'd taken his shot. He'd proven, at least to himself, that skill mattered more than pedigree. That 4 years of teaching himself at night meant something. That he belonged in that conference room just as much as anyone with a degree. Whether the client agreed was out of his hands now. All Evan could do was wait. The afternoon stretched long and empty. Evan picked up Mia, who launched herself into his arms like he'd been gone for months. He took her to the park, pushed her on the swings, bought her ice cream from the cart, even though he probably shouldn't spend the money before he knew if he actually had the job. But she was happy, chattering about everything Mrs. Chen had let her do, and that was worth more than financial sense. His phone stayed silent. By evening, as Evan was putting Mia to bed, he'd convinced himself it was over. The client had decided to go with someone else, or pursue legal action, or simply move on. Harrison and Wells would limp forward with a damaged reputation, and Evan would go back to his 3 jobs and his thrift store blazer and the endless grind of proving himself to people who'd already decided he wasn't worth their time. He just closed Mia's bedroom door when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Conference room A, 7 a.m. tomorrow. C.H. Camille Hart. Evan stared at the message, his heart suddenly pounding. Tomorrow. 7 a.m. That could mean anything. Could be good news. Could be bad news. Could be... His phone rang. Same number. Hello? Mr. Cole? Camille's voice was crisp, businesslike, revealing nothing. The client called. We have their answer. I'll tell you tomorrow. Can't you just... Tomorrow, Mr. Cole. 7 a.m. Don't be late. She hung up before he could respond. Evan sat on his couch in his small apartment, his phone warm in his hand, and tried not to hope too hard. But hope was like gravity. You couldn't fight it forever. Evan arrived at Harrison and Wells at 6:45, wearing the same thrift store blazer he'd worn to the interview, but with a fresh shirt he'd ironed twice. His hands were steady as he pressed the elevator button, steadier than they'd been 3 days ago, but his heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm that felt like possibility and terror in equal measure. The 47th floor was quiet at this hour, the reception area empty except for early morning light streaming through the windows. Evan walked down the familiar hallway, past the conference room where they'd rejected him, past the office where he'd spent 72 hours rebuilding everything, until he reached conference room A. The door was open. Camille sat at the head of the table, alone, 2 cups of coffee in front of her. She gestured to the chair beside her without preamble. Sit. Evan sat, accepted the coffee she pushed toward him, waited. Camille took a long sip from her own cup, her eyes on the windows and the city beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. The client called at 4:30 yesterday afternoon. Miranda, James, and Alex spent 6 hours reviewing your work, stress testing the models, running their own scenarios through the dashboard. She paused. They found 3 minor errors in your validation logic. Evan's stomach dropped. They fixed them. Camille's lips curved slightly. And then they called back to tell me that your work, even with those corrections, was the most rigorous analysis they'd ever received from any consulting firm. Not just from us. From anyone. She turned to face him. They're reinstating the contract. $20 million over 2 years with one condition. What condition? You lead the implementation, full technical oversight. They want the person who built the models to be the person who ensures they work in production. Camille's expression was unreadable. They trust you, Mr. Cole. They don't trust us, but they trust you. The words hit Evan like a wave. He'd been braced for rejection, for the careful corporate language that meant thanks but no thanks, for the door closing just as finally as it had opened. I don't understand, he said quietly. 3 days ago, you rejected me for an entry-level position. Now you want me to lead a $20 million implementation? 3 days ago, you were a risk. Camille's voice was blunt. Today, you're the only reason we still have a client. The math isn't complicated. She pulled a folder from beside her chair and slid it across the table. This is your offer. Senior data analyst with lead technical responsibility for Project Horizon. Salary is $95,000 base plus performance bonuses tied to client retention. Full benefits, including health insurance for you and your daughter. 3 weeks PTO. And, she paused, a signing bonus of $15,000. Half when you sign, half at 6-month review. Evan opened the folder with shaking hands. The numbers swam in front of his eyes. $95,000. He currently made $32,000 across his 3 jobs, working 80 hours a week. This was... There's a catch, Camille continued. Always is. You'll be working with Marcus Webb as your technical supervisor. He's not happy about it. Neither is Justin Kellerman. Half the senior team thinks promoting you this fast is a mistake that will blow up in our faces. Her eyes were hard. They're waiting for you to fail. And if you do, they'll use it to prove that credentials matter more than talent. And what do you think? Evan asked. I think you have 72 hours to learn what most analysts take 6 months to learn. I think you'll be thrown into client meetings where people will question your authority because you don't have a degree. I think you'll face sabotage, bureaucracy, and 100 small humiliations from people who resent what you represent. Camille's voice softened, just slightly. But I also think you're exactly the kind of person this industry needs. Someone who solves problems instead of performing credentials. Someone who actually cares about getting the answer right instead of getting the credit. She tapped the folder. So yes, Mr. Cole, I think you'll succeed, but it won't be easy. Evan stared at the offer letter, at the numbers that represented everything he'd been working toward for 4 years. Everything that would let him quit the custodial job, the delivery shifts, the weekend kitchen work. Everything that would let him pick Mia up from school himself, instead of relying on Mrs. Chen's kindness. Everything that would mean new shoes, actual savings, the breathing room to be a parent instead of just a provider. When do I start? Camille's smile was sharp and approving. Monday, 8 a.m. Wear something better than that blazer. Your signing bonus will clear by this afternoon, so you have no excuse. She stood, extending her hand. Welcome to Harrison and Wells, Mr. Cole. Try not to make me regret this. Evan shook her hand, his grip firm despite the trembling in his chest. I won't. We'll see. The weekend passed in a blur of logistics and stunned disbelief. Evan took Mia shopping, real shopping, at a department store instead of the thrift shop, and bought himself 2 proper suits, 4 dress shirts, 2 pairs of shoes that didn't have scuffs. Bought Mia the sneakers she'd been eyeing for months, the ones with the lights in the heels. Bought groceries without checking his bank balance first, paid Mrs. Chen triple what he owed her, and watched her cry when she realized what it meant. You did it, she said, gripping his hands. You really did it. I got lucky, Evan said. No. Mrs. Chen's voice was fierce. You got your chance. There's a difference. On Sunday night, after Mia fell asleep, Evan sat at his small kitchen table and wrote his resignation letters. 1 to the custodial company, 1 to the delivery service, 1 to Morrison's Diner. The words felt surreal on the page, like he was writing fiction instead of fact. But Monday morning arrived with relentless reality. Evan walked into Harrison and Wells at 7:45, wearing his new suit and carrying a leather portfolio he'd bought specifically to not look out of place. The security guard who'd scrutinized him last week nodded pleasantly. The receptionist smiled with actual warmth. The elevator felt less like a judgment and more like transportation. But when Evan reached the 47th floor, the welcome ended. Marcus Webb stood outside conference room C, arms crossed, his expression a careful mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide the resentment underneath. Mr. Cole, welcome to your first day. His tone made it clear that welcome was purely procedural. We need to discuss how this is going to work. Evan followed Marcus into the conference room. Sandra Pierce was already there, along with 2 analysts Evan didn't know. A woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and carefully neutral expression, and a man about Evan's age who looked at him with unconcealed curiosity. This is Rachel Kim, Marcus said, gesturing to the woman. She'll be your primary technical support on Project Horizon, and this is David Chang, who handles client communications. He sat down, not inviting Evan to do the same. Let me be clear about the situation. You've been hired at a senior level based on 1 successful crisis intervention. That's unprecedented in this firm's history. It's also, in my professional opinion, premature. Marcus, Sandra warned. No, he needs to hear this. Marcus's voice was firm. Mr. Cole, you have technical talent. No one disputes that. But talent isn't enough in this industry. You need to understand corporate politics, client management, team dynamics. You need to know when to push back and when to defer. You need to navigate internal processes that can make or break a project regardless of how good your analysis is. He leaned forward, and you need to prove that your success wasn't a fluke. One good project doesn't make a career. I understand, Evan said evenly. Do you? Marcus's eyes were hard. Because here's what's going to happen. You're going to lead Project Horizon's implementation. That means you'll present to the client every week. You'll justify every technical decision. You'll manage Rachel and coordinate with David. And you'll do it while the entire senior team watches for mistakes. He paused. I will be supervising your work. Every model you build, every recommendation you make, goes through me first. Not because I don't trust you. Well, actually, that's exactly why. You've proven you can handle a crisis. Now prove you can handle the daily grind. The room went quiet. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. David studied his laptop. Sandra's expression was carefully blank. Evan took a breath and met Marcus's eyes. What do you need from me? The question seemed to catch Marcus off guard. What? You're my supervisor. You're responsible for my work. If I fail, it reflects on you. Evan kept his voice steady. So tell me what you need. What standards do I need to meet? What processes do I need to follow? What mistakes should I avoid? He paused. I'm not here to prove you wrong, Mr. Webb. I'm here to do the job. If you can help me do it better, I'm listening. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but a slight easing of the hostility. You'll submit all technical documentation to me for review before client delivery, Marcus said finally. You'll copy me on all client communications. You'll attend the Friday team review meetings and present your progress. And, he paused, you'll ask for help when you need it, instead of trying to hero through everything alone. Done. Good. Marcus stood. Rachel will get you set up with your workspace and credentials. Your first client meeting is Wednesday. That gives you 2 days to prepare a presentation on implementation timeline and technical architecture. I want to see it by Tuesday at 5. Then he walked out, leaving Evan with Sandra, Rachel, and David. Sandra exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected. Did it? Rachel's voice was dry. He didn't throw anything. I'm counting it as a win. Sandra turned to Evan. Marcus is a good technical lead, rigorous, detail-oriented, high standards, but he's also spent 15 years climbing the ladder the traditional way, degrees, certifications, paying dues. Your hiring challenges everything he believes about how careers should work. So he hates me. He's threatened by you, Sandra corrected. There's a difference. Hate is personal. This is professional, which means you can manage it if you're smart. She gathered her things. Do good work. Be humble. Ask questions. Don't give him ammunition. She paused at the door. And Evan, don't try to prove you're the smartest person in the room. Just prove you're the most useful. That's what matters. After she left, Rachel gestured for Evan to follow her. Come on, I'll show you your desk. They walked through the office, past clusters of analysts bent over their work, past project managers in glass-walled offices, past the executive suite where Camille's corner office commanded views of the lake and the city. Rachel stopped at a workspace near the windows. Not a private office, but a good desk with a high-end computer and enough space to spread out. This is you, Rachel said. Login credentials are in the envelope. Network access should be live. If you have issues, call IT. She hesitated. Look, I know this is weird, you being hired like this, but I've seen your work on Project Horizon. The models are solid, better than solid. She met his eyes. So I'm willing to give you a chance, just don't make me regret it. I'll try not to. Good. Rachel almost smiled. First piece of advice, the coffee in the break room is terrible. There's a good place 2 blocks south. And second piece of advice, Marcus isn't wrong about the politics. Technical skills will get you in the door, but office dynamics will determine whether you stay. Watch, listen, and don't assume everyone wants you to succeed." She walked away before Evan could respond. Evan sat down at his new desk, logged into his new computer, and opened his new email account. His inbox was already full: client documentation, project files, meeting invitations, a dozen threads he'd been added to overnight. The reality of what he'd signed up for settled over him like weight. He wasn't just building models in isolation anymore. He was part of a team, part of a hierarchy, part of a system with its own rules and rhythms. He'd have to learn to navigate personalities, manage expectations, balance technical perfection with practical constraints, and he'd have to do it while being constantly watched for failure. Evan pulled up the Project Horizon files and started reading. Tuesday afternoon, 5 o'clock exactly, Evan sent Marcus his presentation for the Wednesday client meeting. 15 slides covering implementation timeline, technical architecture, data integration requirements, and risk management. He'd built it carefully, running every number twice, checking every claim against the documentation, making sure there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that Marcus could use as evidence that Evan didn't know what he was doing. At 5:30, his desk phone rang. "Mr. Cole? My office. Now." Marcus's office was on the 49th floor, in the senior analyst suite where the carpet was thicker and the silence more expensive. Evan took the stairs. It felt presumptuous to take the elevator for 2 floors, and found Marcus's door open. Marcus sat behind his desk, Evan's presentation displayed on his monitor. His expression was unreadable. "Sit." Evan sat. Marcus clicked through the slides slowly, not speaking, just reading. The silence stretched. Evan's palms started to sweat. Finally, Marcus looked up. "Where did you learn to structure technical presentations?" "I taught myself. Watched examples online, studied how other firms formatted their deliverables." "It shows." Marcus's tone was flat. "Your content is excellent. Your technical specifications are thorough. Your risk management section is better than what most analysts produce after 5 years." He paused. "But your formatting is inconsistent. You have 3 different fonts across the deck. Your color scheme doesn't match the firm's style guide. And your timeline visualization is confusing. The Gantt chart flows right to left instead of left to right." Evan felt his face heat. "I'm sorry, Stop." Marcus held up a hand. "I'm not criticizing to be petty. I'm criticizing because this matters. When you present to a client, they're not just evaluating your technical work. They're evaluating your professionalism, your attention to detail, your ability to fit into their world." He pulled up the firm's presentation template. "You need to learn our standards. Use this template for everything. Follow the style guide. Make your work look like it belongs here, because that's the first thing clients notice." "I understand." "Do you?" Marcus leaned back. "Because here's what I need you to understand, Mr. Cole. Your technical skills got you hired, but consistency, professionalism, and reliability will keep you employed. Crisis heroes are impressive, but what clients actually need is someone who shows up every day and does solid work without drama." He turned his monitor so Evan could see it. "I've reformatted your presentation. Study the changes. Learn the patterns. Next time I expect you to get it right the first time." Evan looked at the revised slides. The content was identical, but Marcus had transformed them. Cleaner fonts, consistent spacing, visual flow that guided the eye naturally. It looked professional in a way Evan's version hadn't. "Thank you," Evan said quietly, "for fixing it instead of just sending it back." Something flickered in Marcus's expression. "I told you I'd supervise your work. That means helping you succeed, not setting you up to fail." He closed the presentation. "But Evan, and I'm using your first name now because this is off the record, you're going to make mistakes. You're learning on the job in a way most analysts don't have to. That's fine. What's not fine is pretending you know things you don't or being too proud to ask for help." He met Evan's eyes. "I didn't want you hired. I made that clear. But you're here now and you're my responsibility. So I'm going to push you hard and I'm going to expect excellence. But I'm also going to teach you what you need to know. If you're willing to learn." Evan swallowed hard. "I'm willing." "Good. Get out of here. Client meeting tomorrow at 10. Conference room A. Wear your good suit." "Dad." Wednesday morning, Evan arrived at conference room A at 9:30 wearing his better new suit, the charcoal one that the saleswoman had promised made him look professional instead of just dressed up. Rachel was already there, setting up the display. David stood by the window, reviewing notes on his tablet. "Ready?" David asked. Evan's stomach churned. "As ready as I'll be." "First client presentation is always brutal," David said matter-of-factly. "They're going to push back on everything, test whether you actually know what you're talking about. Just stick to the data and you'll be fine." "What if they ask something I don't know?" "Then you tell them you'll research it and get back to them by end of day." David looked up. "The worst thing you can do is bluff. Clients can smell bullshit from a mile away, and it destroys trust faster than anything else." At 9:55, Miranda Chen walked in with James Porter and Alex something Evan still hadn't caught his last name. They looked more relaxed than during the crisis meeting, but their eyes were still sharp, still evaluating. Camille and Sandra entered behind them. Marcus came in last, taking a seat in the back corner where he could observe without participating. "Good morning," Miranda said, settling into her chair. "Let's see what you've built." Evan pulled up his presentation, Marcus's revised version, and began. He walked them through the implementation plan, step by step. Data integration timeline, model deployment architecture, testing protocols, training schedule, risk mitigation strategies. He kept his voice steady, his explanations clear, and when Alex asked a technical question about database latency, Evan answered with specifics instead of generalities. "What about user adoption?" James asked. "You're building sophisticated tools, but if our team doesn't actually use them, none of this matters." "That's the final phase," Evan said, pulling up the relevant slide. "We're planning 3 training sessions. One for executives focused on strategic insights, one for analysts focused on technical operation, and one for product managers focused on practical application. Each session is hands-on, using real data from your system, so people learn by doing instead of just listening." "Who runs those sessions?" Miranda asked. "I do, with support from Rachel for the technical deep dives." "Why you?" Miranda's tone wasn't hostile, just curious. "Why not someone more senior?" Evan glanced at Camille. Her expression gave nothing away. "Because I built the system," Evan said carefully. "I know every decision that went into it, every assumption in the models, every limitation in the data. If someone has a question, I can answer it. If something isn't working right, I can fix it." He paused. "And because your team needs to trust that this isn't just a consulting product you'll use for 6 months and then abandon, you need to see that there's a real person behind it who cares whether it works." Miranda studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Fair enough. Continue." The presentation lasted 90 minutes. Evan fielded questions about database architecture, statistical methodology, timeline contingencies, and budget flexibility. By the end, his shirt was damp with sweat and his throat was raw, but he'd answered everything they threw at him. "One last question," Alex said. "You've identified 3 critical risks in your mitigation section. What's the 4th one you didn't include?" Evan blinked. There were only 3 risks in his analysis. He'd been thorough, methodical. But Alex was right. There was a 4th risk, one Evan had considered and then dismissed as unlikely. Data quality degradation over time. If the client's source system started collecting information differently, the models would drift. It was manageable, but it was real. "Data quality degradation," Evan said. "If your source systems change how they collect information, new app versions, different tracking implementations, updated privacy policies, the models will need recalibration. It's not catastrophic, but it requires ongoing monitoring." He paused. "I didn't include it because it's addressable through quarterly reviews, which I assumed would be standard practice. But you're right, it should be explicitly called out." Alex smiled. "Good. I like working with people who can admit what they missed." The meeting wrapped up with handshakes and tentative optimism. Miranda confirmed the implementation timeline, James approved the budget allocation, and Alex requested weekly check-ins on technical progress. As the client filed out, Camille lingered. "Well done," she said quietly. "You passed the first test." "What test?" "They were seeing if you'd fold under pressure, if you'd default to corporate speak and dodge difficult questions." Camille's smile was slight. You didn't. You treated them like partners instead of adversaries. That matters. She left before Evan could respond. Marcus approached, his expression still carefully neutral. The data quality risk. How did you miss it? I didn't miss it. I deprioritized it. Same thing in a client presentation. If there's a risk, you call it out. You don't decide for them what's important. Marcus's voice was firm, but not unkind. Learn that now before it costs you. Yes, sir. And stop calling me sir. It makes me feel old. Marcus almost smiled. You did good work today. The formatting was clean, your answers were confident, and you didn't try to bullshit your way through the question you weren't prepared for. He paused. But this was the easy part. Wait until we hit the actual implementation. That's when things get messy. Marcus was right. The implementation was a mess. Not because the technical work was wrong, Evan's models were solid, his architecture sound, but because deploying sophisticated analytics into a real company meant navigating 1,000 tiny conflicts that had nothing to do with data and everything to do with people. The client's IT team didn't trust external database connections. Their security team demanded additional encryption that slowed query performance by 40%. Their product managers wanted real-time dashboards that required infrastructure upgrades the CFO wouldn't approve. Their executives wanted predictive insights but balked at the statistical disclaimers that came with any forecasting model. Evan spent his days in meetings, explaining technical constraints to non-technical stakeholders, negotiating resource allocation with departments that had conflicting priorities, mediating between the client's teams when they couldn't agree on requirements. He wrote documentation, revised specifications, built proofs of concept, and explained the same concepts 5 different ways to 5 different audiences. And every evening, he presented his progress to Marcus, who found something wrong every single time. Your integration testing is incomplete. What happens if their staging environment doesn't match production? Your training materials are too technical. The executives won't understand half of these terms. Your timeline has no buffer. What happens when, not if, when something breaks? It was exhausting, maddening, humbling in ways Evan hadn't expected. He'd proven he could build elegant models in isolation. Now he was learning that elegant models meant nothing if they couldn't survive contact with messy reality. But slowly, grudgingly, things started working. The IT team approved the database connections after Evan spent 2 days documenting every security protocol. The dashboards went live with acceptable performance after Evan rewrote the queries to be more efficient. The executives started trusting the predictions after Evan showed them how to interpret confidence intervals instead of treating forecasts as certainties. And the client's retention rate, the real one, the honest one, started improving. 6 weeks into implementation, Evan pulled the weekly numbers and felt something unfamiliar spike in his chest. Hope mixed with cautious pride. The churn prediction model had identified 200 high-risk users. The client's retention team had reached out with targeted interventions, customized onboarding help, feature tutorials, direct support. 73% of those users were still active. Without intervention, the model predicted only 32% would have stayed. It was working, actually working. Evan included the results in his Friday presentation to Marcus, trying to keep his voice professional despite the excitement humming under his skin. Marcus studied the numbers without expression. Then he looked up. "This is good work, Evan." It was the first time Marcus had called him by his first name in a professional context, the first time he'd given unqualified praise. "Thank you," Evan managed. "Don't let it go to your head. 6 weeks of success doesn't guarantee 6 months." But Marcus's tone had softened. "That said, you've exceeded my expectations. I wasn't sure you could handle the operational complexity of enterprise implementation. I was wrong." He paused. "I'm recommending you for permanent position after your probationary period ends. Full senior analyst, not provisional." Evan felt his throat tighten. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep doing the work." Marcus stood. "And Evan? Thank you for proving that I can learn something too. I've spent 15 years believing credentials were the only path. You've shown me there's another way. That's valuable." He walked out before Evan could respond. That evening, Evan picked up Mia from the after-school program he could finally afford, one with homework help and art classes instead of just childcare. and took her to the zoo. The real zoo, not just the free park with the duck pond. They saw elephants and tigers and polar bears, and Mia's delighted laughter made everything, the stress, the politics, the constant pressure, worth it. "Daddy?" Mia asked as they watched the penguins. "Are you happy now?" Evan looked down at his daughter, at her light-up sneakers and her new backpack, and the ice cream cone she'd asked for without worrying whether they could afford it. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said softly. "I think I am." His phone buzzed. A text from Camille. "Board meeting Monday. They want to see Project Horizon results. You'll present." Evan stared at the message. The board. The people who decided the firm's direction, who held the real power. Another test. Another chance to prove he belonged. He typed back, "I'll be ready." Mia tugged his hand. "Daddy, look! The penguin is swimming!" Evan put his phone away and watched the penguins with his daughter, letting himself have this moment of simple happiness before Monday's pressure returned. He'd spent 4 years working toward this. 4 years of late nights and sacrifice, and refusing to accept that his starting point determined his ending point. And now, finally, he was beginning to see what was possible when someone gave you not just a chance, but the tools to actually use it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made Chicago feel personal, like the wind off the lake was testing whether you really belonged here. Evan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time, and tried to calm the nervous energy coursing through him. The board meeting was at 10. Camille had sent him the attendee list yesterday. 7 board members, 3 senior partners, and the firm's founder, Richard Harrison, who rarely attended operational meetings but apparently wanted to see the Project Horizon results himself. Mia appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed penguin they'd bought at the zoo. "You look fancy, Daddy." Evan turned and crouched down to her level. "I have an important meeting today, with the people who run the whole company." "Are you scared?" He thought about lying, about giving her the confident answer a parent was supposed to give. But Mia was 6 and smart, and she'd spent enough of her life watching him struggle that she deserved honesty. "A little bit," he admitted. "But being scared just means something matters, and this matters a lot." Mia hugged him, her small arms tight around his neck. "You're going to do great. You always do great when things are important." Evan held his daughter close, wondering when she'd become wise enough to say exactly what he needed to hear. Then he kissed her forehead, grabbed his portfolio, and headed out to prove her right. The 49th floor conference room where board meetings were held was different from the spaces Evan had worked in before. The table was solid mahogany instead of glass, the chairs were leather that probably cost more than his first car, and the walls were lined with photographs of the firm's history, groundbreaking projects, important clients, moments that had defined Harrison and Wells over 30 years. Evan arrived 20 minutes early and spent the time reviewing his presentation one final time. He'd built it over the weekend with Marcus's feedback incorporated, every slide formatted to perfection, every claim backed by data, every recommendation tied to measurable outcomes. It was the best work he'd ever done, and he was still terrified it wouldn't be enough. At 9:50, people started filtering in. Camille entered first, nodded to Evan with an expression that gave nothing away, and took her seat. Sandra followed, then Marcus, then 3 senior partners Evan knew by reputation, but had never spoken to directly. The board members arrived in a cluster, distinguished older professionals who carried themselves with the weight of decades in consulting, finance, and corporate leadership. And finally, at 9:58, Richard Harrison walked in. He was in his 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd built an empire and had no intention of watching it crumble. He took the seat at the head of the table, folded his hands, and looked directly at Evan. "Mr. Cole, I've heard interesting things about you." Evan's mouth went dry. "I hope they were mostly good things, sir." "Mostly." Richard's expression didn't change. "I've also heard you were hired under highly unusual circumstances, promoted faster than any analyst in this firm's history, and given responsibility for a project that nearly destroyed our reputation." He paused. "I'm here to see if that was brilliance or desperation on Ms. Hart's part." Camille's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. This wasn't just about Evan. This was about whether her judgment, her willingness to take a risk on someone unconventional, had been vindicated or exposed as reckless. Let's begin, Richard said. You have 45 minutes to convince me that Project Horizon was worth salvaging. Evan stood, pulled up his presentation, and took a breath. 8 weeks ago, Harrison and Wells lost a $20 million contract because our analysis was built on flawed assumptions. We told the client their retention was 91% when it was actually 67%. We told them their active user count was 1.4 million when it was actually 970,000. Evan pulled up the comparison slides. We didn't lie. We didn't fabricate data. We simply failed to question our methodology until it was too late. He clicked to the next slide. This is what we should have delivered from the beginning. Device-level deduplication. Engagement scoring that measures meaning instead of just activity. Churn prediction that identifies at-risk users 30 days before they leave. Customer lifetime value segmentation that tells the client who's actually worth retaining. Evan walked them through the implementation, step by step, the technical architecture he'd built, the integration challenges they'd overcome, the training program that had gotten the client's team actually using the tools instead of ignoring them. Then he pulled up the results. In the 8 weeks since deployment, the client has used our churn prediction model to target high-risk users with retention interventions. Of the 423 users identified as likely to churn, 308 are still active. Without intervention, we predicted only 136 would have stayed. He paused. That's a 41% improvement in retention for the targeted cohort. One of the board members, a woman with severe glasses and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. What's the false positive rate? 22%. We flagged 93 users as high risk who would have stayed anyway. But the cost of a false positive, reaching out to a user who doesn't actually need help, is minimal compared to the cost of missing a true positive. Evan pulled up the financial analysis. Even accounting for false positives, the intervention program has a return on investment of 312% based on customer lifetime value. And this model will continue to perform as the business scales? Another board member asked. Yes, with quarterly recalibration. As user behavior evolves, we'll need to retrain the model, but the architecture is designed for that. It's not a static analysis, it's a living system that gets smarter over time. Richard Harrison had been silent throughout the presentation, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke. What did you learn from this project, Mr. Cole? The question caught Evan off guard. He'd expected technical challenges, methodology questions, implementation details, not philosophy. I learned that being right about the data isn't enough, Evan said carefully. The original analysis was technically correct based on the assumptions we made, but those assumptions were wrong, and that made everything built on top of them wrong too. He paused. I learned that the most important question isn't how do we analyze this data? It's, are we measuring the right thing in the first place? And what else? Evan thought about the past 8 weeks. The meetings where he'd been the youngest person in the room by 15 years, the moments where his lack of credentials had been used to question his authority, the nights he'd stayed late rebuilding queries because someone had pointed out a flaw he should have caught earlier. I learned that consulting isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making the client successful, even when that means admitting you were wrong, even when that means rebuilding everything from scratch, even when that means asking for help because you don't actually know everything. Evan met Richard's eyes. I learned that humility matters more than confidence, and that the willingness to learn is worth more than the pretense of already knowing. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Richard nodded slowly. Ms. Hart, you hired this man over significant internal objections. Explain your reasoning. Camille didn't hesitate. Because he saw in 30 seconds what our entire analytics team missed in 3 months. Because he had the courage to speak up when he could have walked away. Because he did in 72 hours what would have taken most analysts 6 weeks. She paused. And because I've spent my career watching talented people get overlooked because they didn't check the right boxes. Mr. Cole represents exactly the kind of thinking this firm needs. Practical problem solving over credentialism, real-world application over theoretical perfection. And the risk? Richard asked. What if he fails on the next project? What if this was luck rather than skill? Then we'll have learned something valuable about our hiring practices. Camille's voice was steady. But I don't believe it was luck. I believe Evan succeeded because he approached the problem without the assumptions that come from traditional training. He didn't know what couldn't be done, so he did it anyway. Richard turned back to Evan. Mr. Cole, I'm told you worked 3 jobs to support your daughter before joining this firm. Custodial work, delivery driving, restaurant kitchen. Yes, sir? And you taught yourself data science at night, after your daughter went to bed, using free online courses and personal projects. Yes, sir. Why? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. Because I needed to believe that where you start doesn't determine where you end up, Evan said quietly. Because I needed my daughter to see that you can change your circumstances if you're willing to work for it. Because, he paused, searching for words that would capture 4 years of exhaustion and hope and desperation. Because I refused to accept that the best I could do was survive. I wanted to build something, even if it was just a better life for my kid. Richard studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to address the room. I founded this firm 32 years ago because I believed consulting could be more than selling expensive advice that no one implements. I believed we could actually solve problems, deliver real value, make our clients better at what they do. He gestured to Evan's presentation, still displayed on the screen. This is what I meant. Not perfect analysis, not impressive credentials, actual results that matter. He stood, and everyone else stood with him reflexively. Mr. Cole, your probationary period is over. You're hired permanently. Senior analyst with full partnership track eligibility. Richard's voice was firm. But understand something. You're going to face resentment. You're going to be tested constantly. And you're going to have to prove yourself on every project, because people will assume this was a fluke until you show them otherwise. He paused. Can you handle that? Yes, sir. Good. Because this firm needs more people like you. People who solve problems instead of performing expertise. Richard nodded to Camille. Ms. Hart, your judgment is vindicated. Continue finding talent wherever it exists, regardless of pedigree. He looked around the table. This meeting is adjourned. As the board members filed out, several stopped to shake Evan's hand, some with genuine warmth, others with polite professionalism that didn't quite hide their skepticism. Marcus lingered, his expression thoughtful. Partnership track, he said quietly. That's unprecedented for someone at your level. I didn't ask for it. No, but you earned it. Marcus extended his hand. Congratulations. And for what it's worth, I'm glad I was wrong about you. After everyone left, Camille remained, standing by the windows overlooking the city. You did well, she said without turning around. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Don't thank me yet. Camille turned to face him. Partnership track means visibility. It means every project you touch will be scrutinized. It means you're no longer just the person who saved Project Horizon. You're the person who represents a new way of doing things, and people will fight that. I understand. I don't think you do. Not completely. Camille walked closer. When I was hired 20 years ago, I faced the same resistance. Every success was dismissed as luck. Every mistake was proof I didn't belong. It took me 8 years to make partner, twice as long as my peers, because I had to be twice as good to be considered half as qualified. Her voice softened. I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but to prepare you. The path forward isn't going to be easy, but it's possible. I'm proof of that. What do I need to do? Keep your head down and do excellent work. Build relationships across the firm, not just with people who already support you. Take on projects that scare you. Ask for feedback and actually implement it. Camille paused. And remember that you're not just building a career, you're proving that talent can come from anywhere. That matters more than you think. She left, and Evan stood alone in the boardroom, surrounded by photographs of the firm's history, feeling the weight of what he'd just stepped into. Partnership track. The possibility of actually belonging here, not just as an employee, but as an owner. The chance to shape the firm's direction instead of just following it. But also the target on his back. The expectation that he'd fail. The assumption that his success so far had been aberration rather than capability. Evan pulled out his phone and texted Mia's teacher, asking if he could pick her up early from school. Then he texted Mrs. Chen, thanking her again for everything she'd done. Then he sat down in one of the expensive leather chairs and let himself feel the full weight of what had just happened. He'd done it. Actually done it. Gone from rejected job applicant to permanent senior analyst with partnership potential in less than 3 months. But Camille was right. The hard part was just beginning. Chat. The celebration that evening was quiet. Just Evan and Mia at their favorite pizza place, the one with the arcade games and the cheap slice deals. Evan told his daughter about the meeting, simplified enough for a 6-year-old but honest about what it meant. "So you get to stay at your job forever?" Mia asked, her mouth full of pepperoni. "Not forever, but for as long as I keep doing good work." "You always do good work, Daddy." "I try, sweetheart. But sometimes trying isn't enough. Sometimes you have to actually succeed." Mia considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "But you did succeed. They said so." "They did. But now I have to keep succeeding. Again and again. Every time." "That sounds hard." "It is hard." Evan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "But you know what makes it easier? Knowing that I'm doing it for you. So you can have a better life than I did. So you never have to worry about whether we can afford new shoes or whether the electricity will stay on." Mia smiled, and the simple trust in her expression made Evan's chest tighten. She believed in him completely, the way only children could believe in their parents, before the world taught them to be skeptical. He couldn't fail her, wouldn't fail her. Whatever it took. The next morning, Evan arrived at the office to find an email from Justin Kellerman waiting in his inbox. The subject line read, "Wellington Industries, new client opportunity." Evan opened it, his stomach already tightening with anticipation. The email was brief and carefully neutral. Wellington Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company, was looking for help optimizing their supply chain analytics. The project was worth $8 million over 18 months. Justin had been handling the initial conversations, but Wellington's CEO had requested someone with hands-on technical expertise to lead the implementation. Justin was recommending Evan. The email ended with a line that felt loaded. "This would be a good opportunity to prove your capabilities extend beyond crisis intervention. Let me know if you're interested." Evan read it 3 times, looking for the trap. Justin had been openly hostile during the interview, had made it clear he thought Evan's hiring was a mistake, had barely acknowledged Evan's existence during the Project Horizon implementation. And now he was handing Evan a significant new client opportunity. Either Justin had genuinely changed his mind about Evan's capabilities, or this was a setup designed to expose Evan's limitations. Evan called Rachel, who picked up on the second ring. "Did you see the Wellington email?" he asked. "Yep. And before you ask, yes, it's weird. Justin doesn't hand out opportunities to people he doesn't respect." Rachel paused. "My guess? The board meeting changed some calculations. You're no longer just the crisis guy who got lucky. You're someone Richard Harrison personally endorsed. That makes you politically useful." "So this is about politics, not ability." "Everything here is about politics. But that doesn't mean the project isn't real or important." Rachel's voice turned serious. "Look, Wellington is a solid client. The work is straightforward. Supply chain optimization isn't sexy, but it's valuable. If you do it well, you build credibility. If you screw it up, Justin gets to say, 'I told you so,' and your partnership track momentum stalls. Great. No pressure. Welcome to senior analyst life. Every project is a test." Rachel softened. "But Evan, you can do this. Supply chain analytics is just pattern recognition at scale. You've been doing that since your bus route days." Evan hung up and stared at the email. He could say no. Could stick with Project Horizon until it was completely stable. Avoid taking on risk until he'd built more experience. But that wasn't why Camille had hired him. That wasn't why Richard had put him on partnership track. Evan hit reply and typed, "I'm interested. When can we meet with the client?" The Wellington Industries pitch meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at their corporate office in the western suburbs. Evan spent the intervening days researching everything he could find about their business: manufacturing processes, supply chain structure, competitor analysis, industry trends. He built a preliminary framework for how he'd approach the analysis, identified potential data sources, and prepared questions about their current analytics capabilities. Marcus reviewed his prep work Wednesday evening, his expression thoughtful. "This is solid," Marcus said. "But you're approaching it like a technical problem. Supply chain optimization is as much about human behavior as data patterns. The bottlenecks are usually political, departments hoarding information, managers protecting territory, workers resisting changes that might cost them overtime. So how do I address that? You listen first. You ask about their processes, their pain points, their previous attempts to improve things. You let them tell you what's broken instead of assuming you already know." Marcus pulled up a note on his computer. "I've worked with Wellington's operations director before. He's defensive, territorial, and deeply skeptical of consultants. If you come in acting like the expert who's going to fix everything, he'll sabotage you. But if you come in asking to learn their world, he might actually help you. That's the opposite of how most consulting works. Most consulting fails." Marcus met Evan's eyes. "You've succeeded so far because you solve real problems instead of performing expertise. Don't change that approach now." Thursday afternoon, Evan and Justin drove out to Wellington's facility together. The car ride was awkward, filled with the kind of professional small talk that revealed nothing and meant less. But as they pulled into the parking lot, Justin finally said something real. "You know why I recommended you for this project?" "I've been wondering about that." "Because Richard Harrison told the senior partners that people like you are the firm's future. And I'm practical enough to recognize when the political winds have shifted." Justin's tone was matter of fact. "I still think your hiring was premature. I still think credentials matter. But I also recognize that you've delivered results, and in consulting, results are currency." He paused. "So I'm giving you this project because it serves my interest to have you succeed. If you do well, I look smart for recognizing your talent. If you fail, I look smart for having predicted it. Either way, I win." Evan appreciated the honesty, even if the calculation behind it was cold. "And if I succeed beyond expectations? Then I'll have learned something about my own biases, which would be valuable." Justin pulled into a parking space. "Just don't make me regret this." Wellington's operations director, a man named Tom Brennan, met them in the lobby with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been mandated to participate in a meeting he thought was pointless. He was in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades on factory floors, and his handshake had the calluses to prove it. "Mr. Kellerman, good to see you again." Tom's voice was polite but cool. Then he turned to Evan. "And you must be the data guy." "Evan Cole. Thanks for meeting with us." "Let's be clear about something up front." Tom crossed his arms. "I've sat through 6 different consulting pitches over the past 5 years. Every one of them promised to revolutionize our supply chain. Every one of them delivered PowerPoint presentations that looked great and recommended changes that didn't work in the real world. So forgive me if I'm skeptical." "I would be too," Evan said. "Can I ask what specifically didn't work about those recommendations?" Tom blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "What?" "You said the changes didn't work in the real world. I'm curious what the gap was between what they recommended and what actually happened." "They didn't understand our constraints." Tom's voice carried the weight of old frustrations. "One firm told us to implement just-in-time inventory management. Great in theory, except our suppliers are unreliable and we have hard customer deadlines. We can't afford to run lean and miss shipments. Another firm wanted us to centralize procurement. Sounds efficient, except our plants make completely different products with completely different materials. The centralized buyers didn't understand what any of the plants actually needed. So the analysis was technically correct, but practically useless." "Exactly." Tom studied Evan more carefully. "You've seen this before?" "Different industry, smaller scale, but yes. I've made the mistake of building models that work beautifully on paper and fail immediately in reality." Evan paused. "That's why I'd like to spend time learning how your operation actually works before making any recommendations. Not watching from a conference room, actually on the floor, talking to the people who do the work every day." Tom's skepticism didn't disappear, but it softened. "Most consultants don't want to get their hands dirty. Most consultants haven't worked 3 jobs to pay rent. I'm comfortable with dirty hands. Something shifted in Tom's expression. Not quite approval, not yet, but the beginning of respect. All right, let me show you the facility. For the next 3 hours, Tom walked them through Wellington's operation. The receiving docks where raw materials arrived on unpredictable schedules. The production floors where workers had developed unofficial workarounds to deal with inventory shortages. The quality control stations where delays cascaded when parts didn't meet specifications. The shipping department where last-minute expediting had become standard practice. Evan took notes, asked questions, and listened more than he talked. He noticed patterns, the way materials sat waiting at certain bottlenecks, the frequency of rush orders that disrupted normal workflow, the tension between production managers who wanted inventory buffers and finance people who wanted to minimize carrying costs. And he noticed something else. The workers knew exactly where the problems were. They'd been living with them for years, developing coping strategies and informal solutions, but no one had ever asked them what they thought should change. When the tour ended, Tom brought them back to the conference room where Wellington's executive team was waiting. The CEO, CFO, and VP of operations. So, the CEO said, a woman named Patricia Morgan who radiated the brisk efficiency of someone who'd built her career making tough decisions. What's your assessment? Evan glanced at Justin, who gave a subtle nod that meant, your show. I can't give you a full assessment after 3 hours, Evan said carefully, but I can tell you what I'd want to investigate. Your supply chain issues aren't primarily about optimization algorithms or inventory models. They're about information flow. Your suppliers don't communicate delivery schedules reliably. Your production teams don't have visibility into what's in transit. Your procurement decisions are made based on historical data that doesn't reflect current conditions. He pulled out his notepad. Before we talk about analytic solutions, I'd want to understand why information moves so slowly through your system. Because the fastest supply chain in the world doesn't help if you're making decisions based on outdated information. Patricia leaned back. That's a different answer than we usually get. Most consultants probably told you to implement sophisticated forecasting models or optimize your order quantities. Every single one of them. And did any of those implementations succeed? No. Patricia's smile was thin, which is why I'm asking what makes you different. Evan thought about the past 3 months, about learning that technical excellence meant nothing without practical application, about discovering that the hardest part of solving problems wasn't finding the right answer, it was understanding the right question. I'm different because I'm not trying to impress you with how smart I am, Evan said quietly. I'm trying to understand what actually makes your business work, and I'm willing to spend weeks learning your operation before recommending any changes, because premature solutions are worse than no solutions. He met Patricia's eyes. The other consultants failed because they treated your supply chain like a theoretical problem. I want to treat it like a real place where real people are trying to do real work with insufficient information. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia looked at Tom. What do you think? Tom, who'd been leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, straightened slightly. I think he's the first consultant who's asked the right questions. Whether he can deliver the right answers. He shrugged. That remains to be seen, but I'm willing to give him a chance. Patricia turned back to Evan. All right, Mr. Cole, you've got your opportunity. But understand something. We're not interested in another beautiful presentation that doesn't work. We want solutions we can actually implement. Solutions that make our people's jobs easier instead of harder. Can you deliver that? Evan felt the weight of the question. This wasn't about technical capability. This was about whether he could bridge the gap between analytical insight and operational reality. Whether he could take what he'd learned on Project Horizon and apply it to a completely different context. I believe I can, Evan said, but I'll need access to your systems, your data, and your people. Real access, not just scheduled meetings. I need to see how things actually work, not how your documentation says they should work. Done. Patricia stood and extended her hand. Welcome to Wellington Industries, Mr. Cole. Don't make us regret this. The handshake was firm, professional, and carried the weight of $8 million in expectations. On the drive back to the city, Justin was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as they hit traffic on the expressway, he spoke. That was well done. Thank you. I mean it. You handled Tom perfectly. You didn't oversell, you didn't pretend to have answers you couldn't possibly have, and you made them feel heard. Justin paused. I've been doing this work for 12 years. It took me 6 years to learn what you just did naturally. I had good teachers. Evan thought about Marcus's advice, Camille's warnings, Sandra's guidance, and I've made enough mistakes in my personal projects to know what happens when you build solutions before understanding problems. Still, Justin merged lanes, his expression thoughtful. You're changing how I think about talent development. I've always believed the traditional path, top schools, prestigious internships, climbing the ladder step by step, was the only way to build real expertise. But you're proving there's another path, one that might actually produce better consultants because it's grounded in practical problem solving instead of theoretical frameworks. Does that mean you don't think my hiring was premature anymore? Justin smiled slightly. Ask me again after Wellington. 1 successful project is data. 2 is a pattern. But you're building a case. They drove in comfortable silence after that, and Evan watched the city skyline grow closer, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not quite confidence. He'd learned too much about how easily confidence could turn into arrogance. Not quite certainty. There were too many ways this could still go wrong. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of belonging. The sense that he wasn't just surviving in this world anymore. He was starting to understand how it worked, and more importantly, how to make it work for people like him, people who brought talent instead of credentials, solutions instead of pedigree, practical wisdom instead of theoretical perfection. The Wellington Project would be his chance to prove it wasn't a fluke. That Project Horizon wasn't luck, but capability. That he could take what he'd learned and apply it somewhere new, somewhere different, somewhere that would test whether his approach was genuinely valuable or just circumstantially appropriate. As they pulled into the parking garage at Harrison and Wells, Evan's phone buzzed with a text from Mia's after-school program. Your daughter drew a picture of you at work. She says you're a superhero who helps people with computers. Thought you'd want to know. Evan smiled and saved the message. Not a superhero, just a dad trying to build a life worth having. A consultant trying to solve real problems for real people. A man who'd been given a chance and was determined not to waste it. That would have to be enough. The Wellington Project consumed Evan's life in ways Project Horizon hadn't, where Horizon had been a crisis sprint, intense, focused, with clear boundaries and a definite endpoint. Wellington was a marathon through mud. Every discovery led to 3 more questions. Every solution exposed 2 new problems. The supply chain wasn't just inefficient, it was a tangled web of dependencies, workarounds, and institutional knowledge that existed only in people's heads. Evan spent his first 2 weeks on site at Wellington's facilities, arriving before the morning shift and staying past the evening changeover. He shadowed receiving clerks who could predict late deliveries by which trucking company was on the manifest. He interviewed production supervisors who kept unofficial spreadsheets tracking which suppliers consistently sent substandard materials. He sat with procurement managers who explained with barely concealed frustration how the corporate purchasing system forced them to buy from approved vendors even when those vendors were unreliable. The deeper Evan dug, the more he understood why 6 previous consulting firms had failed. They'd treated Wellington's supply chain like a technical puzzle. Optimize this variable, adjust that parameter, implement this software. But Wellington's real problem was cultural. Decades of making do with broken systems had created a workforce that trusted their own informal solutions more than any corporate initiative. Information hoarding wasn't malicious. It was survival. People held on to their knowledge because they'd learned that sharing it usually meant being blamed when things went wrong. On a Thursday afternoon in his 3rd week, Evan sat in Tom Brennan's office, reviewing his findings. He'd filled 3 notebooks with observations, built a dozen preliminary data models, and identified approximately 47 distinct bottlenecks in the information flow. The scope of the problem felt overwhelming. So what's the verdict? Tom asked, his tone suggesting he already expected bad news. Are we beyond saving or just mostly hopeless? Neither. Evan pulled up a diagram on his laptop, a visual map of how information moved, or failed to move, through Wellington's operation. You're not broken. You're incredibly resilient. Your people have built a system of workarounds that keeps things running despite having almost no real-time visibility into your supply chain. That's impressive. But you've hit the limit of what informal solutions can achieve. You're successful despite your systems, not because of them. And that means you're leaving money on the table and burning out your best people who have to constantly firefight preventable problems. Evan traced a path through his diagram. Your receiving department gets delivery notifications an average of 6 hours after trucks arrive. Your production planning is based on inventory numbers that are 48 hours out of date. Your procurement team makes ordering decisions without knowing what's already in transit. He looked up. You're flying blind. The fact that you haven't crashed is a testament to your people's skill, but skill only gets you so far when you don't have information. Tom studied the diagram with the intensity of someone seeing his own frustrations mapped out for the first time. So what do we do about it? We fix the information flow first. Before we touch inventory models or optimization algorithms, we need to make sure everyone has accurate, real-time data about what's actually happening. Evan pulled up another document. I've designed a phased approach. Phase 1 is visibility, implementing tracking systems that tell you where materials are, when they'll arrive, and what condition they're in. Phase 2 is coordination, giving your teams tools to communicate across departments without relying on phone calls and email. Phase 3 is optimization, using that clean data to actually improve how you make decisions. How long? 12 months for all 3 phases. Maybe 14 if we hit unexpected complications, which we will. Evan met Tom's eyes. But here's the important part. This only works if your people trust it, which means we don't implement anything until we've tested it with the people who'll actually use it. I want to build prototypes, put them in front of your workers, and let them tell me what's wrong. Then fix it. Then test again. We iterate until we have something that actually makes their jobs easier. Tom leaned back in his chair, something shifting in his expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. You know what the other consultants did? They spent 2 weeks here, went back to their offices, built their recommendations in isolation, and then presented us with a finished plan. When we said it wouldn't work, they told us we didn't understand our own business. His voice carried old anger. You're saying you want our input before you build anything? I'm saying I need your input. I can build elegant models all day long, but if they don't work in reality, they're worthless. Your people are the experts on reality. I'm just the person who knows how to translate their expertise into systems. That's a different philosophy than I'm used to. It's the philosophy that's kept me from screwing up too badly so far. Evan closed his laptop. But I need your help with something. Your workers don't trust consultants, for good reason. They're not going to open up to me just because I ask nicely. I need advocates, people they respect who can vouch that I'm actually trying to help, instead of just checking boxes. Tom considered this. What are you asking? Form a working group. 10 to 15 people from across your operation, receiving, production, quality control, shipping, procurement. People who do the actual work, not just manage it. We meet weekly. I present what I'm building, they tell me what's wrong with it, we fix it together. Evan paused. And we compensate them for their time. This isn't volunteer work. This is expertise that has value. Patricia will ask if that's necessary. It's essential. You can't ask people to fix a system that's been ignoring them for years and then not pay them for the solution. That's extraction, not collaboration. Tom's smile was slight but genuine. I'll make the case to Patricia. But Evan, if you're serious about this approach, be prepared for resistance. Not from the workers. They'll probably be thrilled someone's finally asking their opinion. But from middle management, the people who've built their authority on being the gatekeepers of information. They're going to see this as a threat. How do I handle that? Carefully, and with backup. Tom stood. Come on, let's go talk to Patricia before I lose my nerve about recommending something this unconventional. Patricia Morgan's office was on the top floor of Wellington's administrative building, with windows overlooking the production facilities. She was on a phone call when Tom and Evan arrived, but she waved them in and wrapped up the conversation quickly. Tom, Mr. Cole, please tell me you have good news. Better than good news, Tom said. We have a plan that might actually work. Evan walked Patricia through the same presentation he'd shown Tom, adapting it slightly to focus on the financial implications. Every hour of delayed information cost Wellington money in expediting fees, overtime, and customer penalties. Every decision made with outdated data increased the risk of overstock or shortages. The cost of implementing better systems would be recovered in less than 8 months just from eliminating the most obvious inefficiencies. Patricia listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When Evan finished, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Why should I believe this will work when 6 other firms failed? Evan could have given her a corporate answer about methodology or expertise or Harrison and Wells's track record, but Patricia struck him as someone who valued directness over polish. Because I'm not trying to impress you with how smart I am. I'm trying to solve your actual problem. Evan pulled up the list of previous consulting recommendations Tom had shared with him. Every one of these firms told you to implement their preferred solution, just-in-time inventory, centralized procurement, advanced forecasting models. They prescribed before diagnosing, and when their prescriptions didn't work, they blamed your implementation instead of their recommendations. And you're different because I spent 3 weeks learning how your operation actually works before proposing any solutions. Because I'm planning to test everything with your workers before we implement it. Because I'm treating this like a collaboration instead of a knowledge transfer. Evan paused. And because I've failed enough times in my own projects to know what it feels like when elegant theory meets messy reality. I've learned to respect reality more than theory. Patricia exchanged a glance with Tom. Something unspoken passed between them. Tom says you want to form a worker advisory group and pay them for their participation. Yes, ma'am. That's not standard practice in consulting engagements. No, ma'am, but standard practice hasn't worked for you. I'm proposing we try something different. It'll add to the project budget. It'll also dramatically increase our chance of success. I can build you a perfect system that no one uses or an imperfect system that actually improves your operation. The difference is whether we involve the people who use it. Evan met her eyes. I'd rather spend money on getting it right than save money by getting it wrong. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, sharp and approving. All right, Mr. Cole. You've got your working group. But understand something. This approach means you own the results. If we implement systems designed by our workers and those systems fail, we can't blame external consultants anymore. The responsibility is shared. I understand. And I accept that responsibility. Good. Patricia turned to Tom. Set up the working group. Make sure we have representation from every key area. And Tom, pick people who'll be honest, not people who'll tell us what we want to hear. Already have a list, Tom said. Most of them are people who've been filing complaints about our systems for years. Figured we might as well put their frustration to productive use. As Evan and Tom left Patricia's office, Evan felt the weight of what he'd just committed to. This wasn't just about building good analytics anymore. This was about changing how an entire organization worked. About proving that solutions built with workers instead of for workers were more effective. About demonstrating that the people doing the work knew more about fixing it than any outside expert ever could. And if he failed, it wouldn't just damage his career. It would validate every skeptic who'd argued that someone with his background couldn't handle complex organizational change. The pressure should have been terrifying. Instead, Evan felt something else. Purpose. The sense that this was exactly the kind of problem he'd spent 4 years teaching himself to solve. Not abstract data puzzles, but real challenges that affected real people's lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. How's Wellington? Marcus says you're doing something unconventional with worker participation, either brilliant or career suicide, possibly both. Evan typed back, definitely both. But if it works, it'll be worth it. Rachel's response came immediately. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Go change the world, or at least this one factory. The first meeting of the Wellington Working Group happened on a Tuesday evening in a conference room that smelled like coffee and metal shavings. 15 people showed up. Machine operators, logistics coordinators, quality inspectors, procurement clerks, and maintenance technicians. They ranged from early 20s to late 50s, from new hires to 30-year veterans. What united them was a shared skepticism visible in every crossed arm and guarded expression. Tom did the introductions, explaining that Evan wanted their input on redesigning Wellington's information systems. Several people exchanged looks that clearly said they'd heard this before. I know you're skeptical, Evan said once Tom finished. You should be. You've been told your opinion matters before, and then watched management ignore everything you said. So let me be clear about what this is and isn't. This isn't me pretending to care about your input while I build whatever I was going to build anyway. This is me genuinely not knowing the best way to solve your problems and needing your expertise to figure it out. That's a nice speech, a woman named Carmen said. She was a production line supervisor with 25 years at Wellington and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had no patience for corporate bullshit. But how do we know you mean it? You don't. Not yet. Evan pulled up his laptop and displayed the preliminary system design he'd been working on, a dashboard that would give production supervisors real-time visibility into incoming materials. This is what I built based on 3 weeks of observation. I think it's pretty good. I also think it's probably wrong in ways I can't see because I don't actually do your jobs. He gestured to the screen. So tell me what's wrong with it. The room was silent for a moment. Then a young guy named Marcus, not the same Marcus from Harrison and Wells, raised his hand tentatively. Can I really tell you what I think, even if it's harsh? Especially if it's harsh. Polite feedback that avoids the real problems doesn't help anyone. Marcus looked at Carmen, who nodded slightly. Then he turned back to the screen. Okay, so this dashboard shows me when materials are arriving, right? That's great. But it doesn't tell me what condition they're in. If a shipment of steel arrives damaged, I need to know immediately so I can adjust the production schedule. Your system tells me the steel is here, but not whether I can actually use it. That's a critical gap, Evan said, making notes. How do you currently find out about damaged materials? Someone from receiving walks over and tells me. If they remember. If they're not busy dealing with 3 other problems. Marcus shrugged. Sometimes I don't find out until we're already behind schedule. What if the dashboard integrated with quality control? Evan sketched the idea. So when receiving logs a shipment, QC gets an automatic notification to inspect it, and the dashboard doesn't show materials as available until QC clears them. That would help, Marcus said, but only if QC actually has time to inspect things immediately. Right now they're always backlogged. So we need to address QC capacity too, which means understanding why they're backlogged. Evan looked around the room. Anyone here from quality control? A woman named Lisa raised her hand. I'm a QC inspector, and we're backlogged because we're inspecting the same materials twice. Once when they arrive and again before they go into production because the production teams don't trust our initial inspection. Why not? Evan asked. Because sometimes the materials that pass inspection turn out to be defective when they're actually used, not because we missed it, but because damage happens between receiving and the production floor. Things get bumped by forklifts exposed to temperature changes or just sit too long. Lisa's frustration was evident. But we get blamed for it, so production teams double-check everything. Which wastes time and makes you seem incompetent even though it's not your fault, Evan said. Exactly. So what if we tracked material condition continuously instead of just at inspection points? RFID tags or sensors that alert if something gets damaged between receiving and production. That would be expensive, Carmen said. Maybe. Or maybe it's cheaper than the current cost of duplicate inspections, schedule delays, and quality failures that don't get caught until materials are already in use. Evan made more notes. But that's a question for cost-benefit analysis. Right now, I'm just trying to understand what actually needs to be fixed. The meeting continued for 2 hours. People who'd started with their arms crossed gradually leaned forward. Voices that had been cautious became animated. The whiteboard filled with problems Evan hadn't known existed, solutions he wouldn't have thought of alone, and connections between issues that only became visible when the people experiencing them explained how everything interrelated. By the time they wrapped up, Evan had 20 pages of notes and a completely revised understanding of what Wellington needed. Same time next week? He asked as people gathered their things. You're serious about this? Carmen asked. Actually building what we talked about? I'm serious about trying. Some of it might not be technically feasible or financially viable, but I'm not going to dismiss your ideas without investigation. Evan paused. And here's the deal. Every recommendation I make to Patricia will include your input. If I propose something you haven't reviewed, that means I'm not listening, and you should call me out. Carmen studied him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand. All right, Mr. Cole, you've got one shot at proving consultants can actually be useful. Don't waste it. The handshake was firm, weathered, and felt like the beginning of something important. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm. Evan split his time between Wellington's facilities and Harrison and Wells's offices, between building technical solutions and navigating organizational politics. The working group meetings became the anchor point. Every Tuesday evening, 15 people who knew Wellington's operation intimately would tear apart whatever Evan had built and help him rebuild it better. Progress was slower than Evan had initially projected, but it was more solid. Instead of implementing elegant theories that might fail, they were developing practical solutions that the workers had already pressure tested against reality. The dashboard evolved through 7 major revisions. The material tracking system went through 4 complete redesigns. The procurement coordination tools were rebuilt from scratch twice. But the solution that emerged was something none of the previous consulting firms had delivered, a system that actually reflected how Wellington worked. Marcus at Harrison and Wells reviewed Evan's progress reports with increasing approval. This is good work. Methodical, thorough, properly validated. You're not moving as fast as I initially expected, but the foundation you're building is much stronger. It doesn't feel fast enough, Evan admitted. We're 4 months in and still in phase 1. Phase 1 is the hardest part. Once you have accurate information flowing through the system, phases 2 and 3 will go much faster. Marcus pulled up Evan's timeline. You're actually ahead of where most implementation projects are at this stage. The difference is you're measuring real progress instead of reported progress. Most projects look good on paper and terrible in practice. Yours will be the opposite. The validation helped, but Evan still felt the pressure. Wellington was paying significant consulting fees, and Patricia Morgan was the kind of executive who measured results and outcomes, not effort. She sat in on one of the working group meetings in month 5, watching silently as the team debated the optimal way to handle urgent material requests. Afterward, she pulled Evan aside. This is very different from how consulting usually works. Yes, ma'am. Is that a problem? No. It's refreshing. Patricia's expression was thoughtful. Tom tells me your workers are more engaged than they've been in years. Several people who are considering leaving have decided to stay because they finally feel heard. That's worth something beyond just operational efficiency. I'm glad to hear that, but we still need to deliver measurable results. You will. I can see the foundation you're building. Patricia paused. But Evan, understand something. Not everyone in my organization is happy about this approach. Some of my middle managers feel threatened by workers having direct access to system design. They're worried it undermines their authority. Are you worried about that? No. I'm worried they'll sabotage your implementation to prove they were right. Patricia's voice was serious. Be careful. Document everything. Make sure you have clear approval chains. And if you encounter resistance that feels like it's crossing from skepticism into obstruction, let me know immediately. The warning proved prescient 2 weeks later. Evan arrived at Wellington for a scheduled data integration test, only to find that the necessary system access had been revoked. The IT manager, a man named Doug Stevens, who'd been politely hostile since day 1, claimed it was a security compliance issue that required additional approvals. How long will that take? Evan asked, trying to keep his frustration in check. Hard to say. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. Our security team is very thorough. Doug's tone suggested he was enjoying this. Evan called Tom, who made calls to IT security, only to discover that no one had actually requested the access revocation. It had been Doug's initiative, justified by a policy interpretation that even security didn't agree with. This is deliberate, Tom said bluntly. Doug's been complaining to anyone who listened that your project is giving workers too much influence over technical decisions. He thinks it sets a bad precedent. What do I do? Document everything, then let Patricia handle it. Tom's voice was grim. This is political now. You can't win a political fight by being right. You need someone with authority to clear the obstacles. Evan wrote a careful email to Patricia explaining the situation, attaching screenshots of the access revocation and the subsequent communications. He kept his tone neutral, focused on facts rather than accusations, and simply noted that the delay would push back the implementation timeline by approximately 2 weeks unless resolved. Patricia's response came 30 minutes later. Meeting tomorrow 9 a.m. Doug, Tom, you, Me. We're resolving this. The meeting was brief and decisive. Patricia asked Doug to explain his reasoning. Doug gave a lengthy technical explanation about security protocols and compliance requirements. Patricia listened without expression, then turned to her IT security director who'd been asked to attend. Is any of what Doug just said actually required by our security policy? No, ma'am. The access Mr. Cole requested is within normal parameters for external consultants. Patricia turned back to Doug. So you unilaterally decided to interpret policy more strictly than the people who wrote it. I was exercising appropriate caution. You were obstructing a project I personally approved. That's insubordination, not caution. Patricia's voice was cold. Mr. Cole's access will be fully restored by end of day. And Doug, if I hear about any other mysterious compliance issues that coincidentally affect this project, we'll be having a very different kind of conversation. Are we clear? Doug's face had gone pale. Yes, ma'am. After the meeting, Tom walked Evan back to his temporary workspace. That's going to have consequences. Doug isn't going to forget being dressed down in front of everyone. I didn't want to escalate it. You had no choice. Some people can't be reasoned with. They can only be overruled. Tom paused. But watch your back. Doug has allies in middle management. They're going to look for ways to prove your approach doesn't work. The warning was validated repeatedly over the following months. Evan encountered mysterious data quality issues that turned out to be intentional corruptions. Testing schedules were changed without notification. Training sessions were understaffed because managers forgot to communicate attendance requirements. Each incident was small enough to be plausibly deniable, but disruptive enough to slow progress. Evan documented everything, maintained professional composure, and focused on the work. But the constant friction wore on him. He'd expected technical challenges. He'd prepared for analytical complexity. He hadn't fully anticipated the energy required to navigate organizational resistance from people who viewed his success as their failure. On a particularly frustrating Friday, Evan sat in his office at Harrison & Wells after everyone else had left, staring at his status report and feeling the weight of everything threatening to break. His phone rang. Camille. You're still there, she said without preamble. How did you know? Because I know what month 5 of a difficult implementation feels like. Come up to my office. Evan took the elevator to the executive suite. Camille's office door was open, and she gestured him in without looking up from her computer. When she finished typing, she turned to face him. Talk to me. About what? About why you're sitting alone in your office at 7 p.m. looking like you're about to give up. Evan hesitated, then decided honesty was the only approach that made sense with Camille. I'm exhausted, not from the technical work, that's going well, but from constantly having to defend the work from people who want it to fail. I spend half my time doing consulting and half my time managing organizational politics, and I'm not good at politics. No one is good at politics when they start. It's a learned skill, like any other. Camille leaned back in her chair. Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. People resist change for 2 reasons. First, because change is genuinely threatening. It might cost them status, authority, or relevance. Second, because change implies criticism. If things need to be different, it means what they've been doing wasn't good enough. Your project does both. It threatens middle managers' control over information, and it implies their previous systems were inadequate. So what do I do? You acknowledge their concerns while refusing to compromise on what matters. Camille's voice was firm. You can't make everyone happy. Some people will never support your approach because it challenges their worldview. But you can build enough support from other stakeholders that the resistors become irrelevant. Patricia supports you. Tom supports you. The workers support you. That's what matters. She paused. The question is whether you can sustain this long enough to prove it works. Because once you deliver results, the resistance will collapse. But until then, you're going to have to keep fighting. What if I can't sustain it? What if the friction becomes too much? Then you'll have learned something valuable about your limits. But Evan, Camille's expression softened slightly. I don't think you're anywhere near your limits. I think you're just experiencing what everyone experiences when they try to change systems that don't want to change. The discomfort means you're doing something meaningful. If this were easy, anyone could do it. Evan absorbed that, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. How did you sustain it? He asked. when you were fighting to prove yourself 20 years ago. I remembered why it mattered. Every time someone tried to push me out, I thought about the next person who'd come after me. If I gave up, it would be harder for them. If I succeeded, it would be easier. Camille's voice carried the weight of old struggles. You're not just building a supply chain system, Evan. You're proving that collaboration produces better results than hierarchical expertise. That workers' knowledge is as valuable as consultants' analysis. That someone without traditional credentials can lead complex organizational change. If you succeed, you make it easier for the next person like you. If you fail, you validate every skeptic who said people like you don't belong here. The responsibility of that felt crushing and galvanizing in equal measure. No pressure, right? Evan said weakly. All the pressure, but also all the support you need. Camille stood. Go home. Spend time with your daughter. Come back Monday ready to finish what you started. And Evan, trust yourself. You've earned that right. Evan left her office feeling steadier than he had in weeks. The challenges hadn't changed, the resistance hadn't disappeared, but his sense of purpose had been reinforced. He picked up Mia from the after-school program, took her to their favorite pizza place, and listened to her talk about her day with the kind of full attention he hadn't been able to give her lately. She'd made a new friend. Her teacher had praised her math homework. She was excited about an upcoming field trip to the aquarium. Normal 6-year-old concerns, the kind of everyday happiness Evan had been working toward for 4 years. Daddy, are you okay? Mia asked suddenly.
Yeah, sweetheart. Why do you ask? You look tired, like you do when work is hard. Evan smiled and squeezed her hand. Work is hard right now, but it's good hard. The kind where you're building something that matters. Like when I do a really big puzzle? Exactly like that. Lots of pieces. Takes a long time, but it's worth it when you finish. Mia considered this seriously. I can help if you want. I'm good at puzzles. You know what? You already help, just by being you, by reminding me why all this matters. Mia beamed, and Evan felt the exhaustion ease slightly. Not disappear, the challenges were still real, the pressure still intense, but perspective returned. He wasn't doing this for abstract professional success. He was doing it for the concrete reality of his daughter's future, for the possibility that she'd grow up in a world where talent mattered more than pedigree, where hard work was rewarded fairly, where people like him could build lives worth having. That was worth fighting for, worth sustaining the friction, worth proving wrong every skeptic who'd assumed he'd fail. Monday morning, Evan returned to Wellington with renewed focus. The working group met, refined the latest system iteration, and began planning for the first full-scale pilot implementation. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but Evan had stopped letting it define his experience. He documented the obstruction, worked around what he could, escalated what he couldn't, and stayed focused on the measurable progress happening despite the friction. By month 7, the pilot system went live in one production line. Real-time material tracking, integrated quality notifications, automated coordination between receiving and production planning. The workers who'd helped design it trained their colleagues, troubleshot issues as they emerged, and iterated improvements based on actual usage. And slowly, undeniably, things started working better. Production delays decreased by 18%. Material waste dropped by 12%. Worker satisfaction, measured through anonymous surveys, increased significantly. The production line running the pilot became the most efficient in Wellington's facility. Patricia attended a working group meeting in month 8 and watched the team discuss expanding the pilot to additional lines. When the meeting ended, she asked Evan to stay behind. The board wants to see results, she said without preamble. Real numbers, return on investment, timeline for full implementation across all facilities. Evan had been preparing for this conversation. He pulled up the analysis he'd built over the weekend. The pilot line has demonstrated clear improvements. Extrapolating to full implementation across all facilities, we're projecting 23% reduction in delays, 15% improvement in material utilization, and approximately $2.4 million in annual cost savings. Full implementation would take another 12 months, with ongoing costs for system maintenance and worker training. Patricia studied the numbers, her expression thoughtful. That's a 3-year return on investment. Acceptable, but not spectacular. Those are just the direct operational savings.
They don't account for worker retention, which has historically been a major cost for you, or the capacity to take on more complex projects because your systems can handle increased coordination requirements, or the competitive advantage of having a supply chain that actually responds to real-time conditions instead of historical averages. Evan paused. The financial case is solid, but the strategic case is stronger. You're building organizational capabilities that your competitors can't match because they're still operating with traditional hierarchical systems. Make that case to my board in 2 weeks. If they approve, we move forward with full implementation. If they don't, Patricia didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Evan spent the next 2 weeks building the most important presentation of his career. Not just charts and financial projections, but a comprehensive narrative about how Wellington could transform from a company fighting to maintain efficiency into one that could adapt faster than anyone in their industry. He worked with the working group to document their contributions, included video testimonials from workers explaining how the new systems had improved their daily work, and built detailed implementation plans that showed exactly how the rollout would happen. Marcus reviewed the presentation 3 times, each time finding ways to make it stronger. Camille attended a practice session and challenged every assumption until Evan could defend each one without hesitation. Rachel helped him prepare for hostile questions, playing devil's advocate until Evan had answers for every conceivable objection. When the day of the board presentation arrived, Evan stood in front of Wellington's executive leadership feeling the same nervous energy he'd felt before the Harrison and Wells board meeting months ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Tom sat in the front row, a visible signal of operational support. 6 members of the working group sat in the back, representing the workers who'd helped build this solution. Evan took a breath and began. He told them the story of Wellington's supply chain, not as a technical problem, but as an organizational challenge that required changing how people work together. He showed them the data, the improvements, the financial case. But more importantly, he showed them the workers who'd driven the solution, who'd contributed expertise that no external consultant could match, who'd proven that collaboration produced better results than hierarchy. When Evan finished, the questions were sharp but fair. The CFO pushed on implementation costs. The operations VP questioned whether the pilot results would scale. The board chair asked how Wellington could maintain the system after Harrison and Wells' engagement ended. Evan answered each question directly, backed by data and worker testimony. And when someone asked whether this approach could work in other companies, Evan didn't oversell. I think it can, but it requires leadership willing to actually listen to workers instead of just saying they do. It requires patience to build solutions collaboratively instead of implementing them unilaterally. And it requires accepting that the people doing the work might know more about fixing it than any consultant ever will. He paused. Not every company is ready for that, but the ones who are will have a significant advantage. The vote wasn't immediate. The board deliberated for 30 minutes while Evan waited outside with Tom and the working group members. When Patricia finally emerged, her expression was carefully neutral. Then she smiled. The board approved full implementation, unanimous vote. They were particularly impressed by the worker involvement. Apparently that's not something they've seen in other consulting engagements. She extended her hand to Evan. Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You've delivered something rare, a solution we actually want to implement. The handshake felt like vindication and responsibility in equal measure. The celebrations that followed the board approval were professional and restrained, but Evan could see genuine satisfaction in Patricia Morgan's eyes and relief in Tom Brennan's shoulders. The working group members left the meeting energized, talking excitedly about what full implementation would mean for their departments. Carmen pulled Evan aside before she left. "You actually did it," she said, and there was something in her voice that went beyond professional acknowledgement. "You listened. You built what we needed instead of what you thought we needed. That's rare." "I couldn't have done it without you," Evan said honestly. "Any of you. This was your solution. I just helped translate it into systems. Don't sell yourself short. Plenty of consultants ask for our input and then ignore it. You actually changed things based on what we said. That takes humility most people in your position don't have." Carmen extended her hand. "Thank you for proving that someone actually gives a damn what workers think."
The handshake was firm and felt like the closing of a circle that had started 9 months ago with skepticism and mistrust. On the drive back to Chicago, Evan called Camille to update her on the board decision. She answered immediately. "I'm assuming good news based on the timing of this call. Unanimous approval for full implementation. They want to expand it across all facilities over the next 12 months. Outstanding. That's a significant win, Evan, not just for the project, but for what it represents." Camille paused. "How do you feel?" It was a simple question, but it hit Evan unexpectedly hard. How did he feel? Exhausted, relieved, proud, uncertain about what came next, aware that he'd just proven something important, but unsure how to sustain that proof across future projects. "I feel like I just ran a marathon," Evan said finally, "and someone just told me there's another marathon starting tomorrow." Camille's laugh was knowing. "That's exactly what this career is. But here's what you need to understand. You're no longer the person who has to prove himself with every project. You've established credibility. Project Horizon saved a $20 million contract. Wellington delivered results that 6 previous firms couldn't. That's not luck. That's capability. Own it. What if the next project is different? What if this approach doesn't translate? Then you'll adapt. That's what good consultants do. They solve problems, not repeat solutions." Camille's voice turned serious. "But Evan, I'm calling a partners meeting next week. I want to discuss your promotion to principal consultant. That's 2 levels above where you are now. It comes with equity participation, client origination authority, and a seat in strategic decisions. Are you ready for that?" Evan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Principal consultant. The level where consultants stopped just executing projects and started shaping the firm's direction. The level that typically required a decade of experience and an MBA from a top program. He'd been at Harrison & Wells for less than a year. "I don't know if I'm ready," Evan admitted, "but I'm willing to try." "That's all anyone can ask. The partners meeting is Wednesday at 2. Be prepared to present your vision for how we should approach worker collaboration on future projects. If you're going to be principal, you need to define what that means beyond just your own success." After the call ended, Evan drove the rest of the way home in thoughtful silence. The promotion would mean more money. Yes, enough to finally start saving for Mia's college education, enough to move to a better apartment, enough to stop worrying about every unexpected expense. But it would also mean more responsibility, more visibility, and more expectations he'd have to meet while people waited for him to fail. When Evan got home, Mrs. Chen was reading to Mia on the couch. His daughter looked up with a bright smile. "Daddy, Mrs. Chen taught me a new card game." "Did she? That's wonderful." Evan thanked Mrs. Chen, who waved off his gratitude with the casual warmth of someone who'd become family rather than just a neighbor. After she left, Evan sat with Mia and let her teach him the card game, following rules that seemed to change whenever they benefited her. "Daddy, you look happy," Mia observed after winning 3 consecutive rounds. "I am happy, sweetheart. Work went really well today." "Does that mean you're not worried anymore?" Evan thought about the partners meeting, the promotion he wasn't sure he deserved, the pressure that would only increase if he accepted it. "I'm still a little worried, but it's good worry, the kind that means you're doing something important." "Like before your big meeting?" "Exactly like that." Mia considered this with her usual seriousness. "Then it'll be okay, because you're really good at important things." The simple faith in her voice made Evan's throat tight. He pulled his daughter close and held her, reminded again that everything he'd fought for over the past year came back to this moment. The ability to be present, to be stable, to give Mia a childhood that wasn't defined by her father's exhaustion and stress. They'd come so far from the thrift store blazer and the scuffed shoes and the desperate hope that someone would give him a chance. But Camille was right. The marathon continued, and Wednesday's partners meeting would determine whether Evan's success had been circumstantial or whether he'd actually transformed into someone who belonged at the highest levels of this firm. The partners meeting took place in the same boardroom where Evan had presented Project Horizon results 9 months ago. This time, the attendees were different. The 7 senior partners who owned Harrison & Wells, including Camille, Sandra Pierce, and Richard Harrison himself. Marcus was there as head of analytics, though he wasn't yet a partner.
Justin Kellerman sat across the table, his expression neutral in a way that suggested he'd already formed his opinion, but was waiting to see how the discussion unfolded. Camille called the meeting to order and got straight to the point. We're here to discuss Evan Cole's promotion to principal consultant. I'll let Evan present his case, then we'll discuss. She nodded to Evan. You have 20 minutes. Evan stood, pulled up his presentation, and took a breath. This wasn't about defending his past work. They already knew his results. This was about articulating a vision for how Harrison and Wells should evolve. 9 months ago, I walked into this building as someone with no credentials, no network, and no reason to believe I belonged here. The only thing I had was a willingness to solve real problems in ways that actually worked. Evan pulled up a comparison slide. Traditional consulting says the consultant is the expert who diagnoses problems and prescribes solutions. The client's role is to implement what we tell them. That model produces impressive presentations and mediocre results. He clicked to the next slide, showing the Wellington implementation timeline, with worker input integrated at every stage. The model I've developed says the client's workers are experts on their own reality. Our role isn't to tell them what to do, it's to help them build systems that amplify what they already know. We bring analytical rigor and technical capability. They bring operational wisdom and practical constraints. Together, we create solutions that actually work because they're grounded in reality instead of theory. Richard Harrison leaned forward slightly. And you believe this approach scales beyond the 2 projects you've completed? I believe it's the only approach that consistently produces lasting results. Project Horizon succeeded because I listened to the client's feedback and built something responsive to their actual needs. Wellington succeeded because I involved workers who understood problems I couldn't see from the outside. Evan paused. The common thread isn't me being brilliant. It's me being willing to admit what I don't know and collaborate with people who do. That's very humble, one of the senior partners said, a man named Douglas Reeves who'd been with the firm since its founding. But consulting clients pay for expertise. They want consultants who have answers, not consultants who ask questions. They pay for results, Evan corrected gently. Expertise that doesn't produce results is just expensive conversation. I'm proposing we shift from selling our credentials to selling our outcomes, from promising sophisticated analysis to promising measurable improvement, from positioning ourselves as experts who know better to positioning ourselves as partners who collaborate better. And how does that translate to client acquisition? Justin asked. Most clients hire us because of our reputation, our prestigious analyst backgrounds, our methodological sophistication. If we're just facilitating collaboration, why wouldn't they hire someone cheaper? It was a fair question, and Evan had spent considerable time thinking through the answer. Because collaboration is harder than prescription. It requires consultants who can navigate organizational politics, build trust with workers who've been ignored for years, translate between technical and operational language, and design systems that balance analytical rigor with practical feasibility. Evan pulled up the Wellington financial results. We can charge premium rates not because we have fancy degrees, but because we deliver solutions that actually get implemented and produce returns. The 6 firms that worked with Wellington before us all had prestigious backgrounds. None of them delivered results. We did. That's worth paying for. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Camille spoke. Evan, what you're describing is essentially a new service line. Worker-centered implementation. If we promoted you to principal, would you be willing to develop this as a formal offering? Build methodologies, train other consultants, bring in new clients who want this approach? The question was loaded. Principal consultants were expected to generate revenue, develop practice areas, and expand the firm's capabilities. Evan would be betting his career that this approach was replicable by others, not just something that worked because of his specific background. Yes, Evan said, but with one condition. We don't just train consultants in the methodology. We change how we hire. We start bringing in people with diverse backgrounds, people who've worked on factory floors, people who've managed logistics operations, people who understand operational reality because they've lived it. We complement our analytical talent with practical expertise. That's a significant cultural shift, Douglas said. This firm has always prided itself on hiring from top programs. And we should continue doing that. But we should also create pathways for people who learned outside those programs. Evan thought about his own journey, about the nights teaching himself at his kitchen table. There's talent everywhere. We're just not looking in all the places it exists. If we change that, we'll have capabilities our competitors can't match. Richard Harrison had been silent throughout the presentation, but now he spoke. Mr. Cole, you're proposing we fundamentally rethink how we approach consulting, that we value outcomes over credentials, that we hire based on capability rather than pedigree, that we position ourselves as collaborators rather than experts. He paused. That's either visionary or naive. Which is it? Evan met his eyes. It's both. It's visionary because it challenges assumptions that haven't been questioned in decades. It's naive because I haven't encountered all the obstacles that will emerge when we try to scale this. But I'd rather be visionary and naive than cynical and stagnant. Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been approval. I built this firm 30 years ago because I believed consulting could be more than selling expensive advice. I believed we could actually make our clients better at what they do. He looked around the table at his partners. We've been successful. We've built an excellent reputation, but we've also become comfortable, safe. We hire the same kind of people from the same kind of schools and deliver the same kind of analysis. That's sustainable, but not exceptional. He turned back to Evan. What you're proposing is uncomfortable. It threatens some of our assumptions about what makes a good consultant. It requires us to acknowledge that expertise can come from unexpected places. But it's also the kind of thinking that could make us genuinely distinctive in a market where most firms are indistinguishable. Richard stood, and everyone else stood reflexively. I'm calling for a vote. Promotion of Evan Cole to principal consultant with responsibility for developing worker-centered implementation as a new service line. All in favor? Camille's hand went up immediately. Sandra followed. Marcus raised his hand after a moment's hesitation. Justin surprised Evan by raising his as well, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Douglas and 2 other senior partners kept their hands down. 4 votes in favor, 3 opposed. In partnership decisions, that meant approval. Motion carries, Richard said. Evan, you're now a principal consultant. Congratulations, and welcome to the hardest job you've ever had. Partners meeting adjourned. As people filed out, several stopped to shake Evan's hand. Some with genuine warmth, others with the polite professionalism that masked skepticism. Douglas lingered, his expression thoughtful. I voted against your promotion, he said bluntly, not because I doubt your results, but because I'm not convinced your approach is replicable. You've succeeded in part because of who you are, someone who's lived in both worlds, who can translate between operational reality and analytical frameworks. I'm not sure that's a trainable skill. You might be right, Evan admitted, but I won't know unless I try. And if I'm wrong, at least I'll have failed trying something worth doing. Douglas's smile was slight but genuine. That's a better answer than I expected. Prove me wrong, Mr. Cole. I'd be happy to be wrong about this. After everyone left except Camille, she gestured for Evan to sit back down. How are you feeling? Terrified, excited, uncertain whether I just made a huge mistake by promising something I might not be able to deliver. That's exactly how you should feel. The day you stop being terrified is the day you've stopped pushing yourself hard enough. Camille pulled out a folder. Here's your new compensation package. Principal salary is $180,000 base, plus equity participation that should be worth another $60,000 to $80,000 annually, depending on firm performance. You'll get an office on this floor, an administrative assistant, client origination budget, and most importantly, autonomy to develop your practice area how you see fit. The numbers were staggering. Evan had gone from making $32,000 across 3 jobs to nearly $250,000 in less than a year. It felt surreal, unearned, like something that would be taken away as soon as someone realized they'd made a mistake. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Evan said quietly. No one is ever ready. You just become capable as you go. Camille's voice softened. But Evan, understand what you've signed up for. You're not just responsible for your own projects anymore. You're responsible for training others, for bringing in new business, for representing the firm in ways that extend beyond just technical delivery. That's a different kind of pressure. How did you handle it when you were promoted? Poorly, at first. I tried to do everything myself, burned out within 6 months, and had to learn the hard way that delegation is a survival skill, not a luxury. Camille smiled slightly. You'll make mistakes. You'll overcommit and underdeliver occasionally. You'll discover that some people you thought would support you won't, and some you dismissed will become crucial allies. That's all normal. What matters is whether you learn from it. And if I fail, if this service line doesn't work, then you'll have tried something ambitious and discovered its limitations. That's valuable too. But Evan, Camille's expression turned serious. Don't catastrophize failure. You've already proven you can deliver results. Now you're trying to scale that capability. If it works, you'll have built something significant. If it doesn't, you'll still have your individual success to fall back on. The downside is manageable. The upside is substantial. Evan absorbed that, feeling the weight settle more comfortably. Camille was right. He was betting on an ambitious vision, but he wasn't betting everything. And even if the service line failed, he'd still have proven that his initial success wasn't a fluke. That was enough to build on. The weeks that followed were a blur of new responsibilities. Evan moved into his office on the 49th floor, hired Rachel as his practice area deputy since she'd been invaluable on both previous projects, and started developing formal methodologies for worker-centered implementation. He wrote training materials, conducted workshops for other consultants, and began conversations with prospective clients who'd heard about Wellington's results. The response was mixed. Some executives were intrigued by the promise of solutions that actually worked. Others were skeptical that involving workers would produce better outcomes than traditional top-down consulting. And a few were openly hostile, viewing the approach as undermining management authority. Evan learned to identify which clients were genuinely open to collaboration and which were just looking for someone to validate decisions they'd already made. He turned down 3 engagements that wanted impressive analysis but had no intention of implementing it. That earned him criticism from partners who thought he was leaving money on the table, but Evan held firm. I'd rather deliver results for clients who want them than produce reports for clients who'll ignore them, he explained at a partners meeting where his client selection was questioned. Our reputation is built on outcomes. Bad engagements damage that reputation more than lost revenue hurts our finances. The argument was pragmatic enough that most partners accepted it, though Douglas remained skeptical. You're turning down work because clients aren't collaborative enough. What happens when you run out of collaborative clients? Then I'll have learned something valuable about market demand. But I don't think we will run out. I think there are more leaders who want real solutions than we give credit for. They're just exhausted by consultants who promised the world and delivered PowerPoints. 6 months into his role as principal, Evan brought in his first major client, a healthcare system struggling with patient flow optimization. The engagement was worth $12 million over 2 years and explicitly requested the worker-centered approach after their COO had spoken with Patricia Morgan at an industry conference. Evan assigned 2 consultants to the project, one from a traditional top-tier MBA program, one who'd spent a decade as a hospital administrator before transitioning into consulting. The pairing worked remarkably well. The MBA consultant brought analytical rigor and modeling expertise. The former administrator brought operational wisdom and the ability to speak the language of healthcare workers. By month 4, they delivered preliminary results that exceeded the client's expectations. Patient wait times decreased by 21%. Staff satisfaction improved significantly. The engagement became a case study that Evan used to demonstrate the approach to other prospective clients. But not every project succeeded. An engagement with a technology company failed spectacularly when middle management sabotaged the worker collaboration process because they viewed it as threatening their authority. Despite Evan's best efforts to navigate the politics, the project collapsed after 6 months with minimal results and a dissatisfied client. The failure hurt, both professionally and personally. Evan had to present the postmortem at a partners meeting, acknowledging what went wrong and what he'd learned. Douglas was vindicated in his skepticism. This approach works when organizational culture supports it, but many organizations aren't ready for this level of worker involvement. We can't force cultural change through consulting methodology. You're right, Evan admitted. I underestimated the political resistance. I should have identified those warning signs earlier and either addressed them or walked away from the engagement. So what will you do differently next time? Better client qualification, more thorough assessment of organizational readiness before we engage, and clearer executive sponsorship with consequences for leaders who obstruct the process. Evan pulled up his revised methodology. I built a readiness assessment that evaluates not just whether a client wants our approach, but whether their organization can actually support it. We'll use it to screen engagements going forward. The failure had been expensive and embarrassing, but it had also taught Evan critical lessons about the limitations of his approach. Not every problem could be solved through collaboration. Not every organization was ready for worker empowerment, and recognizing those boundaries was as important as pushing against them. A year after his promotion to principal, Evan sat in his office reviewing the practice area's performance. They'd completed 8 engagements, 5 successes, 2 moderate results, 1 failure. Revenue had exceeded projections by 18%. Client satisfaction scores were the highest in the firm, and 3 consultants had specifically requested transfers into Evan's practice area because they wanted to work this way. Rachel knocked on his door frame. "Got a minute?" "Always. What's up?" "Marcus just told me he's recommending you for partner track. Full equity partner, not just principal. That's a 5-year acceleration from normal timing." Rachel's expression was complicated. Proud, concerned, uncertain. "Are you ready for that?" Evan honestly didn't know. Partner meant ownership, yes, but it also meant ultimate accountability. Partners bore financial risk when the firm struggled. They made decisions that affected everyone's careers. They represented Harrison and Wells at the highest levels of business and professional communities. "I'm not sure anyone's ever ready for that," Evan said carefully, "but I appreciate Marcus's confidence. It's not just confidence, it's recognition that you've built something valuable, a practice area that differentiates us from competitors, a methodology that produces results, a reputation that brings in clients." Rachel sat down. "But Evan, partnership also means politics at a whole different level. The partners don't always agree. They have competing visions for the firm's direction. You'll be in the middle of those fights. How do you navigate that?" "Carefully, with integrity, by staying focused on what actually matters instead of getting sucked into ego battles." Rachel paused. "But also by accepting that you can't make everyone happy. Some partners will always see you as the person who got promoted too fast, who represents a threat to how things have always been done. You'll never fully win them over. You just have to outvote them." That evening, Evan picked up Mia from the tutoring program he could now afford, one that would help ensure she stayed on track for college, something he'd never had access to himself. They went to a restaurant nicer than pizza, celebrating nothing in particular except being together. "Daddy, why do you work so much?" Mia asked over dinner, her expression serious in the way that meant she'd been thinking about this for a while. "Because I want to give you a good life, better than the one I had." "But you had a good life, right? You're happy." Evan thought about that, about the years of exhaustion and uncertainty, about working 3 jobs and teaching himself at night, about the constant fear that one unexpected expense would break them, about the desperation that had driven him to keep applying to Harrison and Wells even after repeated rejections. "I'm happy now," he said carefully. "But it was really hard for a long time. I want things to be easier for you. I want you to have opportunities I didn't have. I want you to not have to fight as hard as I did to prove you deserve good things." Mia considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. "I think you deserved good things all along, Daddy. You just had to wait for other people to see it." The simple wisdom of that statement hit Evan hard. She was right. He'd always had the capability. He'd always had the work ethic and the intelligence and the determination. What he hadn't had was opportunity, access, the chance to prove what he could do. And when someone, Camille, had finally given him that chance, everything had changed. "You're very wise, sweetheart. I get it from you," Mia said matter-of-factly, then returned her attention to her pasta. Evan sat there watching his daughter eat, feeling the full weight of how far they'd come and how much had changed. A year and a half ago, he'd walked into Harrison and Wells in a thrift store blazer, desperate for a chance. Now he was a principal consultant on track for partnership, earning more than he'd ever imagined possible, building a practice area that was changing how the firm operated. But the core of who he was hadn't changed. He was still the person who'd taught himself data science at night, who'd built bus route optimizations and inventory systems because he couldn't stop seeing patterns and wanting to fix things, who'd walked back into that crisis meeting because he'd spotted an error everyone else had missed. The difference was that now people listened when he spoke. Now his ideas had weight. Now he had the platform to prove that talent existed everywhere, not just in prestigious programs and traditional backgrounds. That responsibility felt heavy, but it also felt right. The partners' meeting where they'd vote on Evan's partnership was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, 15 months after his promotion to principal. Evan spent the morning reviewing his presentation, not defending his past work, which spoke for itself, but articulating his vision for Harrison & Wells's future. When he entered the boardroom, all 7 current partners were there. Camille at the head of the table, Richard Harrison beside her, Sandra, Marcus, Justin, Douglas, and 2 other senior partners whose support Evan was less certain of. "Let's begin," Richard said without preamble. "Evan, you know why we're here. Make your case." Evan pulled up his presentation, his hand steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. 18 months ago, I walked into this building as someone who didn't belong. Today, I'm standing here as someone who's proven that belonging isn't about credentials. It's about capability, about delivering results that matter, about solving real problems instead of performing expertise. He clicked to the first slide. Since becoming principal, my practice area has generated $8.3 million in revenue, maintained a 92% client satisfaction rate, and won 3 major contracts specifically because clients wanted our collaborative approach. He walked them through the numbers, the client testimonials, the measurable impacts. Then he shifted to the bigger picture. But this isn't just about my success. It's about what my success represents. A year ago, this firm hired exclusively from top-tier programs. We valued credentials over capability. We assumed the traditional path was the only path. Evan pulled up data on Harrison & Wells's recent hires. In the past year, we've hired 4 consultants with non-traditional backgrounds. All 4 are outperforming expectations. 2 have already been promoted. 1 just brought in a major client. We're proving that talent exists everywhere when we bother to look for it. "And you want us to make this permanent?" Douglas asked. "To fundamentally change our hiring philosophy based on 18 months of results?" "I want us to expand what we consider qualification, not abandon traditional criteria, but supplement them. Hire the Harvard MBAs and the self-taught analysts. The consultants with prestigious internships and the ones with operational experience. Build a firm that has capabilities our competitors can't match because we're drawing from a broader talent pool." Richard leaned forward. "If we make you partner, you're not just responsible for your practice area anymore. You're responsible for the firm's direction. You'll have a vote on strategy, on hiring, on which clients we pursue. That's significant authority for someone with your tenure." "I understand, and I'm ready for it." "Why should we believe that?" Evan thought about all the ways he could answer that question, about his track record, his results, his demonstrated capability. But what came out was something simpler and more honest. "Because I've already bet my entire career on this firm believing in me. I've worked harder than I've ever worked in my life. I've delivered results that other consultants said were impossible. I've built a practice area from nothing and proven it generates value." He paused. "But more than that, I understand what it means to be underestimated. To have people assume you can't do something because you don't fit their expectations. If I'm partner, I'll spend my career making sure we don't make that mistake with others. That we give chances to people who deserve them, even when they don't look like what we expect talent to look like." The room was quiet. Then Camille spoke. "I've spent 20 years at this firm. I've seen consultants come and go. I've watched people with perfect credentials fail and people with unconventional backgrounds succeed. And I've learned that what matters isn't where someone started. It's what they do with the opportunities they get." She looked around the table. Evan has done more with his opportunities than most partners do in a decade. He's proven his capability repeatedly. He's brought in significant revenue. He's built something genuinely innovative, and most importantly, he's demonstrated the judgment and integrity we should want in firm leadership. "I agree," Marcus said. "I voted against Evan's initial hiring. I was wrong. I've spent the past year watching him build a practice area that's become one of our competitive advantages. He's earned partnership. Justin was next. Evan represents exactly the kind of evolution this firm needs. We've been successful doing things the traditional way, but traditional doesn't mean optimal. If we want to stay competitive, we need to innovate. Evan is innovation embodied. I'm voting yes. Sandra nodded. I'm in favor. Evan has demonstrated everything we should want in a partner: client results, practice development, strategic thinking, and cultural impact. The question isn't whether he's qualified, it's whether we're ready to embrace what his partnership represents. Douglas was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. I've been skeptical of Evan since day one. I thought his hiring was reckless. I thought his promotions were premature. I thought his approach wouldn't scale. He paused. I've been wrong about all of that. Not completely wrong. His approach does have limitations, but wrong enough that I need to acknowledge it. Evan has delivered results and built something valuable. That deserves recognition. He looked at Evan. I'm voting yes, but I'm also going to keep challenging you because that's how we stay sharp. I wouldn't want it any other way, Evan said. Richard Harrison stood and everyone else stood with him. I founded this firm on the belief that consulting could actually matter, that we could make real differences in how organizations operate, that our work could have lasting impact beyond just generating fees. He looked at Evan. You embody that belief more than anyone I've seen in 30 years. You solve real problems, you deliver real results. You care about making clients actually better, not just looking impressive. He extended his hand. Welcome to partnership, Evan. Don't make us regret this. The handshake was firm and carried the weight of everything Evan had worked toward for the past 18 months, the past 4 years, his entire life. As partners filed out, several stopped to congratulate him. Some with genuine warmth, some with professional courtesy, all acknowledging that something significant had shifted in Harrison & Wells' history. Camille lingered after everyone else left. How are you feeling? Like I just climbed a mountain and discovered there's another mountain behind it. That's partnership, but Evan, Camille's voice was soft. Take a moment to appreciate what you've accomplished. You've gone from rejected job applicant to equity partner in 18 months. That's unprecedented. It's also proof that everything you believed about talent and opportunity was correct. Skills do matter more than credentials. Hard work does create possibilities. People who start with nothing can build something significant. I couldn't have done it without you, without that first chance. I gave you 10 minutes. You did everything else. Camille smiled. But you're right that opportunity matters, which is why I'm asking you to pay it forward. Find the next person who doesn't fit traditional molds but has undeniable capability. Give them their 10 minutes. That's what partnership means. Not just your own success, but creating opportunities for others. I will, Evan promised. I'll spend my career doing exactly that. After Camille left, Evan sat alone in the boardroom for a few minutes, letting the reality settle. Partner, equity owner, voice in strategic decisions, financial security beyond anything he'd imagined possible. But more than that, validation. Proof that the years of exhaustion and uncertainty had been worth it. That refusing to accept limitations had been the right choice. That betting on himself, even when no one else would, had paid off. Evan pulled out his phone and called the one person who deserved to hear this news directly. Mrs. Chen answered on the second ring. Mr. Cole? Is everything all right? Everything is perfect. I just became a partner at Harrison & Wells, which means I owe you everything, because if you hadn't watched Mia during those early days, none of this would have been possible. There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Chen's voice came through, thick with emotion. I knew from the first time I met you that you would do great things. I just had to wait for the world to catch up. Congratulations, Mr. Cole. You've earned every bit of this. After the call, Evan went to pick up Mia early from her after-school program. She came running when she saw him, her backpack bouncing. Daddy, why are you here so early? Because I have good news to celebrate, and I wanted to celebrate it with you. Evan swept her up into a hug. Remember how I told you I was working really hard to build a good life for us? Uh-huh. Well, today I got promoted to partner at my firm, which means we're going to be okay, more than okay. We're going to be stable and secure, and you're never going to have to worry about whether we can afford things. Mia looked at him seriously. Does this mean we can get a dog? Evan laughed, the sound carrying relief and joy and the simple happiness of a problem he could actually solve. Yeah, sweetheart. We can get a dog. They went to the zoo, the real one, not just the free park, and spent the afternoon watching penguins and elephants and polar bears. Evan bought Mia ice cream with extra toppings and let her pick out a stuffed animal from the gift shop. They sat on a bench overlooking the seal pool, and Evan felt the last of the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years finally ease.
Daddy? Mia said, leaning against him. Are you happy now?
Evan looked at his daughter, at her light-up sneakers and her new backpack and her stuffed penguin clutched in her arms. Thought about the office with his name on it, the partnership agreement he'd sign tomorrow, the financial security that would let Mia pursue whatever dream she developed without limitations. Thought about the working group at Wellington, about Carmen's handshake and Tom's respect and Patricia's acknowledgement that someone had finally listened. About the consultants in his practice area who were learning that collaboration produced better results than hierarchy. About the clients who'd specifically requested his approach because they were tired of impressive presentations that didn't work. Thought about the journey that had brought him here. The 3 jobs, the late nights, the thrift store blazer, the moment when Camille had given him 10 minutes that had changed everything. Yeah, sweetheart, Evan said, pulling Mia close. I'm really, genuinely happy. And I'm grateful for every hard moment that got us here, because they taught me what matters. Not where you start, not what credentials you have, not who believes in you at the beginning. What matters is whether you're willing to work for what you want, whether you refuse to accept that your circumstances define your limits, whether you take your shot when you get it. Mia nodded seriously, though Evan suspected she was absorbing the tone more than the words. That was fine. She'd understand eventually. When she was older, he'd tell her the full story, about being dismissed in interviews, about finding the error that everyone else missed, about building solutions with workers instead of for them, about proving that talent existed everywhere when people bothered to look. He'd tell her so she'd know that she could do anything, that her starting point didn't determine her destination, that hard work and intelligence and refusing to give up actually mattered. But for now, it was enough to sit on this bench, watch the seals, and let himself feel the simple, profound satisfaction of having built exactly the life he'd been fighting for. The marathon was far from over. Partnership meant new responsibilities, new pressures, new mountains to climb. But Evan was ready for them. He'd spent his entire life preparing for challenges that tested his limits. He knew how to work when exhausted, how to learn what he didn't know, how to solve problems instead of performing expertise. And most importantly, he knew he didn't have to do it alone. He had Camille's mentorship, Marcus's guidance, Rachel's support. He had clients who trusted him and workers who taught him that expertise came from experience, not credentials. He had a daughter who believed in him completely and a community of people who'd helped him get here. That was more than enough. As the afternoon sun slanted through the zoo, casting long shadows across the pathways, Evan made a quiet promise to himself. He'd spend the rest of his career paying forward the chance Camille had given him. He'd find people who didn't fit traditional molds but had undeniable capability. He'd give them their 10 minutes, their opportunity to prove what they could do, because that's what the world needed. Not more gatekeeping, not more credential worship, not more assumptions that talent only looked one way. What the world needed was people who recognized that genius could emerge from anywhere, that capability mattered more than pedigree, that the person cleaning offices at night might be teaching themselves data science, that the delivery driver might have insights that Harvard MBAs would miss, that the kitchen assistant might be building models that would one day save $20 million contracts. The world needed to give those people their chances, their 10 minutes, their moment to show what they could do when someone finally stopped seeing where they'd been and started seeing where they could go. Evan had gotten his chance. Now he'd spend his career creating chances for others. That felt like purpose worth having, a life worth living, a legacy worth building. And as Mia tugged his hand, eager to see the polar bears one more time before they left, Evan stood and followed his daughter toward whatever came next. No longer just surviving, but genuinely thriving. No longer begging to belong, but secure in the knowledge that he'd earned his place through capability, dedication, and the refusal to accept that his starting point defined his ending point. The story that had started with a rejection in a glass and steel tower had become something else entirely. A testament to resilience, a proof that opportunity and talent could transform lives. A reminder that sometimes the person who doesn't look qualified becomes exactly the person you need. Evan Cole had walked into Harrison & Wells wearing a thrift store blazer and scuffed shoes, carrying nothing but determination and self-taught skills. He'd become a partner carrying something far more valuable, the proof that where you start matters less than what you do with where you end up. And that sometimes, the best investment a company can make is giving someone a chance to show what they're capable of when they finally get the opportunity they've been working toward all along.